This took me a lot longer to make than I thought it would. As always, there will be a section at the end of this video where I explain what the holdup was, but I think it's worth acknowledging right here that I way underestimated how much time it would take to make this. I want to apologize up front for the wait and thank everybody who was anticipating this video for their patience. In this video, I'll be talking about the Metro franchise. I read all the books and played the games they're based on, and I'd like to take an in-depth look at where the series succeeds and fails. I'll be covering all the games while interjecting book details here and there, but there will be a more detailed book discussion before moving into Metro Exodus so we can save the longest portion for last. The book discussion isn't as detailed as I would have liked, but it was fairly lengthy, so I tried to hit the main points without explaining every little detail. Before we get into heavy spoiler territory, I'd like to give a brief summary of my thoughts on the games and books, but it will include some light spoilers in the footage. I'd like to say up front that the footage I recorded did not come out very smooth. I wasn't experiencing frame drops in-game, so I don't know why that's how it came out in the footage, but I wanted to share that now and apologize in advance if that gets on your nerves. I did some testing with other games and they came out just fine, so this seems to be an issue with Metro on PS4. I figured that most of you guys are going to listen to this as opposed to watching it anyway, so this probably isn't going to be an issue for some of you. There is no one single game or book in this series that I would consider a masterpiece, although I think that Metro 2033 is the best in both categories. Metro Last Light was still fun, but it makes some questionable choices by adding bosses that aren't very interesting to fight, and Metro Exodus goes even further by forgetting to balance their boss encounters altogether. Some people would be more forgiving towards these issues since Exodus came out 5 years after Last Light, and we all know what happens to game studios over long periods of time, but most of these issues are so blatantly obvious that I'm surprised they were never addressed. I'll go into more detail about that in the Exodus section, but just know that I caused an alert one time by stealth killing a guard in a room by himself with no witnesses. This is something that I never had happen in Metro 2033 or Last Light. I think those two were the most enjoyable stealth games I've ever played, but I'm not particularly a connoisseur of the stealth genre, so my experience is limited. I would say that Metro 2033 was consistently fun throughout the experience, Last Light was occasionally frustrating, but mostly fun, and Exodus managed to be both my favorite and least favorite in the franchise because every good moment was met with something else that brought the experience down. The stories of these games aren't all equal either, and the same could even be said for the books. Each game takes liberties from the book it's based on, except for Last Light, which was based on a subplot about Artyom's time between Metro 2033 and 2035. It's important to know that Dmitry Glukovsky, the author of the books, did work with 4A Games and wrote the story for Metro 2033 and Last Light. That's one of the reasons why the stories are so consistent between the games and books, because it was the same man writing both. Either Glukovsky had already planned to include the events of Last Light in Metro 2035 and just transitioned it over to the game, or he wrote the plot of the game first and included it into the book after the fact. Metro 2034 is a side story with a mostly new cast and some recurring characters that are probably going to shock some of you who only played the games, but I don't think any of it would have translated well into a game. Metro Exodus takes the most interesting events in Metro 2035, condenses the plot twist that I wasn't very fond of, and rewrites the story going forward. They change many of the characters' personalities, and I think this was the best decision they could have made. I think 2034 and 2035 are tied for my least favorite story, with the latter leading by a small margin just because it was twice as long as the former. Neither of them reached the heights that the first book did in its storytelling or the number of grammatical errors contained within it. I'll talk more about it in the book discussion, but reading the books was the literary equivalent of playing a Bethesda game on release. If you consider yourself a bit shallow and pedantic, then you might have a hard time enjoying this book series, but I still heavily urge you to get over it and read it anyways, because if I were to continue my analogy of a Bethesda game, you'll find it to be more akin to Fallout New Vegas than Fallout 76. The world of the Metro is really fascinating, and I don't think the second and third books are bad. I just enjoyed the first one much more, and the next two weren't as engaging for me. I do want to say, to the right person, these books will be a lot better than the first one, especially Metro 2035. To summarize what I mean without starting that book discussion right now, Metro 2033 has several pages of dialogue that is nothing but talk about philosophy, religion, and various other things that contribute to Artyom's character development. Metro 2034 has some of this, but I usually ended up skipping over it because it wasn't all that interesting, and Metro 2035 had almost none of it, or at least nothing that I can remember since I finished it in early January. What it did have was showing more of the actions of the Metro's inhabitants than their opinions. If you have a short attention span, or just don't care about what these people have to say, then you'll probably enjoy Metro 2035 much more because of its more straightforward storytelling. But if you have a short attention span, then I seriously doubt you're watching this video at all. Personally, I thought that the concepts provided were very interesting, and there was enough downtime between these talks, so it didn't feel like it brought the story down. I think I've talked enough about the books for now, so I'll save the rest of my thoughts for that section of the video. Let's get into the games themselves, starting with an overly detailed gameplay analysis. I'll be spoiling everything from here on out. There are several things I'd like to mention before we begin. First, I played the Redux version of these games. I've read that there were some significant changes to the game in this version compared to the original. The AI was reworked, weapon handling was improved, and many voice lines were altered. The most notable change is that children in the original actually sound like children instead of middle-aged women who were heavy smokers.
Are you Artyom? Hey, there's a man at the Black Street waiting for you. He's kind of big and scary. And he doesn't smell good either. Ugh. I'll guide you there for one bullet.
Are you Artyom? Hey, there's a man at the Black Street waiting for you. I'll guide you there for one bullet.
There was nothing more immersion-breaking than meeting an NPC in Exodus who was very obviously the person who voiced every child in 2033 and Last Light.
There used to be a comm center before the war. My mother worked there. She was an officer. The facility is long abandoned.
From what I found on YouTube, many other voices were kept the same, which makes me wonder why this was changed at all. The UI was reworked, there used to be cutscenes that aren't there anymore, and I've read that there was originally no limit to the amount of ammo you could carry. I've also read some forums where people claim that the AI was dumbed down significantly compared to the original. They say that stepping on glass, dropping bodies, and other things that made noise used to have an effect on stealth, and that it no longer does. I can't confirm any of these since I don't own the original game, but I will say that the enemy awareness in the Redux version was questionable at times. As of today, you can only buy the Redux version of the games on Steam, so if anybody watching owns the original, feel free to leave a comment about the changes you've noticed and whether or not these Steam forums are full of shit. I'd also like to mention that it's very hard to talk about one game of this franchise without discussing all of them, especially concerning the game's mechanics. After playing through all the games, I can confidently say that Metro 2033 is the most consistent of them in almost every way. Last Light and Exodus do some individual aspects better. Last Light has better resource management and slightly better enemy AI. Exodus has much better gunplay, weapon mods, characters, and in my opinion the best main story in the franchise, but Metro 2033 is consistently solid in every area. I think that Metro 2033 is the best game in the franchise, but it isn't the one I had the most fun with, and it's not my favorite. That's not to say that the game is bad, all of them succeed and fail in their own ways. Many of the game's elements are interconnected in a way that makes it hard to separate and analyze them individually. It's a tightly designed formula that complements the game's setting and atmosphere. The developers wanted to break the mold of the first-person shooter genre and do something unique while also remaining true to Glukhovsky's novels. The Wikipedia page for Metro Last Light says that they wanted to create an atmosphere that was, quote, the opposite of Call of Duty, so that really shows the mindset behind these games. To say that 4A Games was successful in their attempts would be an understatement, because even today there aren't very many games that offer the same experience as Metro. The closest comparison I can think of would be the Stalker series, which I'll admit I haven't played, but it's an easy comparison to make because the founders of 4A Games had worked on Shadow of Chernobyl and left the studio a year before the game's release. I'm sure that some of you guys can find a lot of examples, but from my experience, there really aren't that many first-person shooters that have such a careful balance between gameplay, narrative, and setting. Some games will do one or two of these things very well, like Halo Reach, who puts a heavier focus on the setting than anything else, but few games manage to achieve such a strong equilibrium. The world of the Metro is bleak and depressing, full of hostile mutants and even more hostile people, and somewhere in between lie the ghosts of the dead as they relive the final moments of their life. I read the books before playing the games, and I was shocked at how much Metro 2033 nails the atmosphere of its source material, likely because Dmitry Glukhovsky was involved in the game's writing, but that's not to discredit the developers who helped bring this world to life. There's a perfect balance of combat and horror in the first game, and it's something that was slowly lost with each consecutive release, but it's also possible that by the end of my marathon I was familiar with the world's quirks, and so they had less of an effect on me. Mostly. The atmosphere is the core of the Metro experience, and it's easy to see how it influenced the rest of the game's design. Survival horror elements like resource management were introduced to keep you on edge during the stealth sections, and they would reward you for getting through encounters quietly. The stealth was designed with several paths that let you choose how to sneak through the room, and I was often rewarded for paying attention to what was going on around me. There's a section in the first game that has you sneaking through an ongoing battle between the Reds and the Reich. If you decide to pass through stealthily, you can overhear about a drainage pipe that could be used to slip past the Reich's defenses. I'm not sure if this is the only way to get through this area without a fight, but it isn't an obvious choice either. You really need to pay attention. I wouldn't consider the enemy AI in this game smart, but it does take at least some amount of effort to get past without getting caught. I played all 3 games on survival hardcore, and the only one where I frequently struggled with stealth was in Exodus. Other than that, I didn't struggle all that much, but that's not to say the stealth in the franchise is too easy. There were several sections in these games where I decided to dip into my reserves and shoot my way out because I felt it was the most efficient way to get through it, but I never felt like I was forced to break stealth because an area was impossible to get through otherwise. The only time I was forced to break stealth was when I ran out of filters on the surface in the first game and needed to speedrun my way through the second half of the level before I suffocated. It took me longer than it needed to, and I think this says more about how stubborn I am than anything else, but I eventually powered my way through it. I was frustrated when this happened, but I knew it was my fault too. I wasted too much time and didn't manage my resources properly.
Don't worry, buddy. You're doing fine. I won't let you blow this. What kind of place is this?
It's a good thing then that the shooting always felt comfortable and reliable. There aren't any hit scan weapons in the franchise, or at least not any that I could find. On hardcore mode, enemies typically die as quickly as you do, with a few exceptions like juggernauts and some mutants. The way combat is designed adds a lot of tension to the fight that doesn't leave the difficulty feeling artificial. You need to manage your ammo and health kits, so you're rewarded for landing headshots and taking things slowly. If you're fighting in an area where the gas mask is required, then you also need to keep tabs on your filter supply and avoid taking damage since that can break your mask. Filters are in short supply on hardcore mode, so dealing with enemies quickly is almost a requirement unless you want to spend all your money. The careful balance between resource management, well-crafted levels, and demanding combat all comes together to complement the atmosphere of the setting, and no game does this better than Metro 2033. The system isn't without its flaws though. For starters, the camera sensitivity on the console version of the game is way too low. Aim sensitivity is just fine, but the camera itself is far too sluggish for some sections of the game. Either this was completely fixed for Exodus, or the PC version simply doesn't have this issue, but it would sometimes take a full second to turn around on max sensitivity. I eventually got used to it, and it didn't bring the experience down all that much, but being able to snap between enemies while playing Exodus made fights against mutants much more manageable than it was in the first 2 games, and Last Light has some of my least favorite sections in the franchise because of this problem. One example is a section where you need to ring a bell in a flooded metro tunnel so a fisherman can ferry you to another station. Once you ring the bell, a bunch of Nosalises swarm you and you need to fend them off. I died multiple times here because I would be getting hit from behind and I couldn't turn around in time to stop whatever was attacking me. I eventually had to train them like I was playing COD Zombies and take them out while they were all in front of me, and playing like this makes it very obvious that this is not how the combat was designed. This example also shows another criticism I had. The game's combat doesn't function very well during the shooting gallery sections. This can be seen the most at the end of Metro 2033, the mutant and boss fight sections of Last Light, and basically any open battle in Exodus except for one section right after the first region. These sections tend to break up those carefully balanced elements in a way that seems good for variety, but I didn't feel like it complemented the game's combat very well. It's very likely that this is all personal preference, and I want to acknowledge that now. You can make a strong case that these parts add some much needed variety to the gameplay and function as a resource dump to keep you from being too comfortable, and I would agree with that perspective, but I still almost never had fun with them and much preferred combat against human NPCs. I agree that a mid-game resource dump is a good way to keep the players on their toes, but it also runs the risk of making the difficulty feel artificial. Some sections started to make me question the intentions behind their design. Am I taking all this damage because I'm performing poorly, or is this encounter designed to drain my health kits? As far as some of the on-rail sections are concerned, it seems like damage was an expected part of the design, and I don't think that works well in a game with strict resource management, despite how cool the set piece is. Still, I can't help but feel like this all comes back to the camera. Whenever you need to fend off a dozen Nosalises and your camera moves slower than Mr. Krabs on ketamine, some damage is unavoidable, and every hit taken is a medkit lost. Whether or not you agree with this criticism is going to heavily depend on which difficulty you played on and how much fun you had during these sections, but I always found the game to be at its best in tightly designed stealth sections with multiple paths through the level. Metro Exodus commits so many sins in so many areas that I'm going to save that discussion for when I talk about the changes to the game's formula. For now, I need to learn you some knowledge on the game's factions so you aren't confused little shrimplings during the story discussions. There are a lot of names and factions in the Metro universe, and it can be a bit confusing if you're not familiar with them all. The books do a very good job at explaining everything, albeit with several page lore dumps about the setting's history, but the games don't even give you that much. I didn't have a firm grasp on all the concepts until I'd finished the third book, so I'd like to help prevent any confusion by explaining everything now. There are 5 main factions in the Metro universe, and I think they're a good place to start. First, there's the Communist Party, which was started after some survivors, mostly veterans and members of the proletariat, which is the Russian working class for those of you unfamiliar with the term, began feeling nostalgic about the Soviet Union and decided to try and start another communist revolution. This new red wave, sporting the Soviet flag, began to spread throughout the neighboring stations in a way that plays out surprisingly close to the spread of the Soviet Union in real-world history. They rapidly took up supporters until they met their Iron Curtain in the form of the second faction, Hansa. The Hanseatic League, or Hansa for short, were the survivors who reside at the Ring Line, which was the intersection of all the railways in the form of a large ring. Since the ring was the intersection of all neighboring stations, it quickly became a meeting place for business and traders, and they also grew in size and power until they formed their own nation. The Hanseatic League in real-world history was essentially a merchants' guild in medieval Germany. Somebody in the Metro made the connection between the two and the name sort of stuck. You can basically consider them the greedy, corrupt capitalist organization that everybody wants to emigrate to because of the nation's high quality of living. There's even a character in the Metro 2033 book who gets sent to a year of hard labor shoveling shit out of their septic tanks, and he considers this punishment to be an achievement because it means that once he's released, he gets to remain in Hansa territory. That's how desperately people want to live there. The stations that the communists inhabit is referred to as the Red Line. This is a railway that cuts straight through Hansa territory. The name is ironic because it happens to be a literal red line on a map of the Metro, but eventually became a way to describe that all the stations are communist red. It's actually a really neat detail. There was a war between Hansa and the Reds whenever the communists decided to try and conquer the entire Metro when people began to reject their propaganda. The war went on for a year and a half until a compromise was eventually found and a peace treaty was signed. There's also the Fourth Reich, which are the bad people that I can't call directly what they are because I feel like YouTube will flag the word and take down this video. They believe that genetic mutations make you impure and think that they should either be used as slave labor or just outright killed. They're essentially what the devs for Fallout the Frontier thought the Enclave were, except in Metro they're even more of a racist, fascist paramilitary organization that is objectively evil. Jokes aside, there are a few parallels between the two, but the overwhelming majority of their ideology comes from Nazi Germany. The next major faction is Polis. This is an independent nation made up of 4 stations that form the unofficial capital of the Metro. They're one of the only stations that are fully lit, and many visitors have to wear sunglasses to prevent from going blind due to how bright it is compared to the rest of the Metro. Polis is split into 2 castes. You have the military and the Brahmins, which are the scientists, historians, and the like. Together, the leaders of these parties form the Polis Council, which is the nation's government. Polis is also the headquarters of the final and most prominent faction, the Order. This is a small, shadowy special forces organization with no political affiliation whose only goal is to protect the Metro from anything that threatens its survival. They're described in the book as the Metro's immune system by Hunter, who is a character you meet early in both versions of Metro 2033. Members of the Order are called Spartan Rangers, and they're led by Colonel Miller. The games posture the Order as the de facto good guys, but in the books, you learn that things aren't so black and white. Keep in mind that there are even more factions in the books than just these. A smaller group of communists who rejected the Red leadership and follow the Cuban communist ideologies of Che Guevara, a tribal group of cannibals who worship a religion that was fabricated by the station's leadership in order to keep them under their control, and the Metro's own pseudo-Illuminati that we'll take a closer look at in the book discussion. None of these are actually seen in-game, but you can hear about them via NPC conversations in various stations. And I think learning about these unessential factions helped deepen my appreciation for Metro's world. So, hopefully now you have at least a basic understanding about the different forces at play in the Metro. The games don't do a very good job at introducing the player to all of these groups, specifically Hansa, since it's the only one that isn't really easy to understand. I figure that most people will be able to guess what the Reds and the Reich are about from their name alone, but Hansa gets so little screen time before Metro Exodus that I didn't even know they existed, and that's not what you want for arguably the most powerful and successful nation in the Metro. With all the setup out of the way, let's actually talk about the damn game. Before you reach the menu, you'll be greeted with a cutscene that explains the premise of Metro's world. You play as Artyom, a young man who was born just before the world was destroyed and claims to remember nothing about his old life in Moscow. This will be later retconned, and the book never explicitly says that he has no memory of his old life. I'm a little surprised that they didn't change this line when they recast Artyom's voice actor for the Redux version of the game, but that's not important for this scene. The surface world was rendered uninhabitable after a nuclear war, and only professionals called stalkers are willing to make trips outside. The game takes place 20 years later, and the survivors have made their new life in the Moscow metro. But Artyom says that he never gave up hope that they'd one day return to the surface. This is another detail that fits in the context of the Metro 2033 novel, but would later be retconned as the series moved forward. I'll only be pointing these details out to avoid confusion when discussing the entries to the series, so keep in mind that I'm not trying to be pedantic. A lot of these details make sense in relation to the story they're based on, and it's not like the novels are without their own inconsistencies, like how Artyom is described as just over 20 in Metro 2033, but he's somehow 26 to 27 in Metro 2035. This is more of a retcon than a plot hole, but you could also just say that the amount of radiation he's sustained since Metro 2033 has caused him to age more rapidly. And even though that answer is complete bullshit and I literally just made it up, it actually makes a ridiculous amount of sense given the context of the story. Back on topic, Artyom says that a new threat has appeared and is threatening the existence of the surviving humans, and you see some Russian man get killed by some ghost-like entity. The actual game begins near the end of the story. You're climbing to the surface with somebody named Miller for reasons that we'll learn going forward. The footage for the first few missions is incredibly dark because I hadn't turned up the brightness, so I apologize in advance for anybody who's trying to watch this outside on a sunny day. This opening basically serves as a tutorial and ends with you fighting against a horde of watchmen, which are the wolf-like mutant. Eventually, you'll get attacked by demons, which are the large flying mutants that are essentially apex predators and damn near impossible to kill, and I don't mean that from a gameplay perspective either. They can literally take several direct hits from a grenade launcher in the books before dying. One flies directly at you and then the screen cuts to black. I think this sequence does a good job at teaching you the basics of combat, showing you that the power can be turned on and off and what the switches look like, demonstrating how dangerous the surface world actually is, and showing off some of the endgame weapons all at once. It's a well-crafted tutorial and a strong opening to the game. The next quest takes place 8 days earlier in Artyom's home station, Exhibition, or as it's called in the book, Vyzdavka do Zizheny do Novokozyaevska, or VDNKH for short. This translates to Exhibition of Achievements of National Economy, and I found the word exhibition to be easier to pronounce than Vedunk, which is unironically how I read the name in my head because spelling out VDNKH got tiring after the 5,000th time reading it. I promise I'm not going to stop and mention every minor difference between the books and the games, but this was something I just wanted to share. You're greeted by Artyom's stepfather, Alex. The games give no backstory or explanation to Alex's character that I could find, so some of you who have only played the games may not know that he's Artyom's adopted father after his mother died, but they were never actually married. He says that his friend Hunter should be arriving at the station shortly, and he wants you to be there to greet him. You'll quickly learn that the station is suffering from frequent mutant attacks from mutants called the Dark Ones. They don't kill their victims outright, but they do significantly damage their mind, which eventually leads to their death. You make it to the door leading to the surface when Hunter arrives. Shortly after they start talking about the Dark Ones, a pack of Nosalises begin to attack the station. Nosalises are basically mutated moles and are the most common mutants underground. You defend the station against the attack and Alex begins to lose his nerve. He swears that the Dark Ones use fear as their weapon, and that's what made the Nosalises break into the station. They were trying to get away from the Dark Ones. He begins explaining how the Dark Ones are the next stage of evolution that have surpassed humanity. Hunter chastises Alex for being too willing to lay down and accept his fate against the Dark Ones, and basically says that if he's going to die, he'll die fighting. This is a much shorter version of Alex's monologue from the book, and while I appreciate them condensing the 2-page, single-spaced rant, I think they could have done a better job at conveying just how hopeless Alex truly believed their situation was, and the extent of Hunter's rejection of what he's hearing. He goes on in the book about the depths humanity has sank to and how there's no way they could possibly hope to oppose a threat like the Dark Ones, how humanity is now obsolete and a slow, agonizing death is all that awaits them. You also don't get to see how violently Hunter rejects this sentiment and how he ultimately accuses Alex of trying to drag as many people to their death as he can because he's too much of a coward to die alone. The argument gets pretty intense, and while the phrasing for the English translation is awkward at best, it still gets the point across. To put the entire discussion in Hunter's own words, fuck your evolution, let other species wait their turn. What a Chad. During this discussion in the game, the Dark Ones destroyed the outer guard post. Hunter decides to go and recon the tunnels that the Dark Ones are coming from, and he gives you his dog tag, saying to find a man named Miller in Polis if he doesn't come back by morning. After this, he's never seen again. Artyom now needs to find an excuse to leave the station since he can't just tell his stepfather that he's going to Polis due to how protective he is, so he volunteers as a guard for a caravan moving to Riga station. Here you get introduced to Eugene, who is a criminally forgettable side NPC that is supposed to be based on Artyom's closest friend, and I didn't even realize that this was supposed to be Xenia until the end of Metro Exodus. It doesn't help that the books use the Russian version of the names while the games translate some of them into their English counterparts and left the rest alone. It's a very strange decision in my opinion, and it caused no end of confusion when I was trying to identify these characters. You gather your gear and make your way to the railcar. You have a choice to stop and say goodbye to Alex before you leave, but you're not required to. You get on the railcar and make your way to Riga when you're told that you need to take a service tunnel because the main one is blocked off. As you pass through, everybody begins passing out as a large ball of light approaches you. You're pulled into a dreamlike state where you see Hunter get knocked down by a dark one. It also begins doing something to you too, and as it walks away, Hunter kills it with a revolver. If you didn't have your flashlight on during the tunnel sequence, or you just weren't paying attention, then you will have missed all the ghosts that reside in the tunnel, including the ghost of a dark one that you pass through. I'm not sure if this ghost is tied to the vision Artyom has, but I really don't understand what's going on here either. Are we reliving the last moments of this dark one, or Hunter's? Is Artyom having a fever dream and this is just a manifestation of what's on his mind at the moment, or is it something else entirely? I have an idea of what this could be, but I'm going to save it until later because it would spoil most of the plot. Regardless, the sequence doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's likely to just confuse the player more than anything. Artyom regains consciousness first, and he quickly starts waking up the rest of the crew. You're being pursued by a horde of Nasalises, so you need to fend them off until you make it to Riga. Eventually, you'll be knocked off the railcar and take cover behind some wooden boards. The guards at Riga were able to kill the first wave of Nasalises, and you reach the station before they kill the rest with a flamethrower. You and the boys go to get some drinks at the bar to celebrate not dying. They seem to think that Artyom is immune to whatever knocked everybody out. This is true, Artyom is immune, but the game directly contradicts this fact by making you pass out with them. In the book, he's mostly unaffected while the rest of the convoy slowly loses their mind, and he leads them to the station where they come back to their senses. You walk around the station where a middle-aged woman trapped in the body of a little boy says that a man is looking for you, and he'll lead you to them if you pay him. I'm a greedy bastard, so I decided to go find him myself. You're then introduced to Bourbon, who says that he needs to get to Dry Station for some business with some friends of his. Riga is on lockdown, but he knows of a curse station that they could use to get there. Since everybody is talking about your immunity to the tunnel shenanigans, he thinks you would make the perfect guide. He says that if you lead him there safely, he'll give you his Kalashnikov, which is probably my favorite word after the amount of times I've had to read it. He actually says AK, but I need excuses to say Kalashnikov as many times as possible in this video since I may never get to say it again. Since you don't have any other way out of Riga, and because there's a free Kalashnikov on the line, you accept Bourbon's offer and make your way to the tunnels. I turned up the brightness by this point, so it should be a lot easier to see now, but it still may be a little dark for some of you. There are a few areas where you can take a detour, and you'll learn very quickly not to accidentally step on a lurker's tunnel. This section serves as a light tutorial to stealth and tunnel travel while not holding the player's hand, which I tend to appreciate. That being said, I found the first few stealth sections in all the games to be some of the toughest due to the lack of branching paths, so I wasn't able to get by this one without a fight. Some things to know about the stealth are that you have the choice of knocking out or killing your victims. I always opted to kill them because leaving dangerous people alive never felt like a good option to me. These people are bandits, they prey on the less fortunate, so they deserve everything that's coming to them. Actions like this play into the morality system, which I'll talk about in length at the very end of the game, since it'll be the most relevant there. Once you get past the bandits, you'll fight some Nasalises and eventually make it to a room full of dead bodies. Bourbon tells you to search them for anything valuable while he tries to get the door open. This causes you both to start phasing in and out of reality as a strong wind tries to push you back into the tunnel. Bourbon starts slowly losing his mind, and something reaches out and pulls you to the other side of the gate, which causes him to regain his sanity. You make it to the market station where the guards save you from another wave of Nasalises. The station leadership recognizes Bourbon, which means he needs to bribe them not to arrest him, and while he's talking, you're free to stock up on anything you need. He eventually spends enough money to avoid getting put in the slammer, and you're told that you need to cross the surface in order to get to Dry Station. You approach the large hermetic door leading to the surface and make your way into the ruins of Moscow. In the next mission, you and Bourbon will be separated, and you'll be forced to find your own way through the city. I'd like to take a moment to talk about the dynamic between the underground and surface sections of the games. The Metro manages to capture a strong feeling of unease as you travel through it. The tunnels are dark and dangerous, full of supernatural entities that you can't explain, and can even give off some real feelings of claustrophobia. You'd think that the open spaces of the surface world would be much better by comparison, but they only feel more dangerous. While in the Metro, you at least know that enemies can only come from 2 or 3 directions, but the same isn't true for the surface. Watchmen are everywhere, and they can easily sneak up on you from any direction. Demons are constantly flying around, and despite how they appear, encounters with them aren't always scripted. They can grab you if you're not careful. I remember how on edge I was the first time I traveled to the surface on my very first playthrough of this game. There's a dark one in an abandoned building that doesn't attack you, and I vividly remember screaming and pulling the trigger the second I saw it because it startled me so badly. Some of you are going to say that I'm a little bitch who can't handle horror, and I am, but you also need to admit that there's a real sense of danger while traveling around the ruined city of Moscow. Even on this last playthrough, I was constantly watching my back to make sure that the watchmen weren't following me, and a majority of my anxiety came from knowing that the camera wouldn't be fast enough to turn around if they snuck up on me. You may notice as you travel through this area that the Dark Ones are watching you and are imparting you with some vision of the past. You'll make your way to the spot that Bourbon told you to meet him and will get attacked by a pack of watchmen. Shortly after, you'll get attacked by a group of demons and forced to retreat back to the safe confines of the metro. You pass through an air duct and make it to Dry Station. Bourbon takes off his backpack so he can fit through the opening and is quickly detained by the bandits that inhabit this station. I took his Kalashnikov anyways because a deal is a deal, it's not my fault if he died in the process, and proceeded to sneak through the station. I could have gotten through this entire level stealthily if I didn't go the wrong way and end up getting caught due to a lack of hiding places, but regardless, you move in and try and save Bourbon. He uses the distraction as a chance to disarm his captor, but he doesn't shoot him, resulting in him getting gunned down. He managed to kill the man who shot him before ultimately dying. At just that moment, another man named Khan drops in from the ceiling and tells you to come with him to Curse Station. Here's a brief summary of Khan's character for both the books and the games. He is just as much of a prophet as he is a psychopath. In the books, he describes himself as the final reincarnation of Genghis Khan, and that because the nuclear fallout destroyed the afterlife, there will never be another one. I'll go into a little more detail about his character in the book discussion, but there is a perfectly legitimate claim that he has either lost his mind or he's a psychic, and maybe even a mixture of both. As far as the games are concerned, Khan is somebody with a deep spiritual understanding of the metro and its secrets. You travel through the tunnels with Khan, and he tells you that if you listen closely, you can hear voices from the pipes. He tells you not to stay too long, and if you ignore him, then the voices scream and push you away. You can see several ghosts as you travel through and get to witness how they died. Khan eventually tells you what I mentioned a minute ago, that the nukes atomized heaven, hell, and purgatory, and the spirits of the dead remain in the metro since there's nowhere else to go. This explanation is also given in the book, but there are also plenty of scientific theories that are given to provide a more rational perspective to the metro's oddities. In the context of the games, Khan's explanation is absolute since there's no way to deny what you're seeing. He takes things one step further by saying that the tunnel is cursed to relive its past over and over, and that those who walk through at the wrong time get sucked into the spiritual vortex. During this mission, you'll get introduced to the Anomalies, which is a much less interesting name for what should obviously be called Shocky Floaties. Just for the record, the Anomalies aren't in the books, and it's likely that this is a concept the devs carried over from the Stalker games. The Anomaly will zap anything it touches and will kill it instantly. Khan has an interesting line where he says that the Anomaly is no stranger than fire, and it all depends on your perspective. He also says that you should try to get a better understanding of things before you make your judgment. This dialogue seems out of place for now, but it will make sense much later, which is why I took the time to bring it up. You then need to defend yourself against an onslaught of Nosollices until another anomaly arrives and clears them out for you. From here, you climb onto a railcar so Khan can drive you the rest of the way to Curse Station. You arrive just as the station is under attack by Nosollices. Your job is to try and close the breaches they're coming from while they're on infinite respawn. This has you trying, or in my case struggling, to locate the bomb that the previous demolition squad was going to use, and then setting up charges to blow the adjacent tunnel. This can take you anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes depending on how much time you spend running around not knowing what to do. Once you're finished, Khan leads you to another path that leads to Armory Station. You're looking for an acquaintance of Khan's, Andrew the Smith. One of the locals informs you that the station is occupied by the Reds, and there's no shortage of paranoia right now. It doesn't take long for you to find yourself on the wrong side of the law when you wander into a room where the police are trying to arrest somebody. Thankfully, he decides that violence is the answer and you two escape. You're saved by our man Andrew, and he gives you a disguise to help avoid detection from the guards. His plan is to smuggle you onto a rail car where you can hitch a ride to the front between the Reds and the Reich and head to Polis from there. They load you into the cargo hold beneath the rail car, and everybody prays that nobody looks down during the trip. Thankfully, nobody does, but you fall out of the cargo hold whenever the rail car hits a bump. From here, you're free to murder everybody and fight your way through the line, or find a way to sneak past them. This is where I found that drainage pipe that leads to the other side, and around the time I started to realize how expertly crafted most of these levels are. If you take this route, then you'll get a chance to save some rangers from an execution. He says that he heard about some rangers in the area and mistakes you for them, and Artyom doesn't correct him because he's a silent protagonist. You then then proceed to sneak past the Reich's defenses in another well-designed level that offers many paths to the objective. Eventually, you'll walk through a door and get captured by some soldiers. They mistook you for a red spy, which makes sense since you did just come from that area, and start discussing how to deal with you. They ultimately decide to execute you, and you're rescued by the actual squad of rangers that was passing through. It's a good thing that they waited before pulling the trigger, or Artyom would be cosplaying as JFK on an afternoon drive. I'd criticize this part for feeling too convenient, but stuff like this happens all the time in the book, so it's a little hard to fault the game for it alone. Artyom shows the rangers who saved him Hunter's dog tags, and they agree to take him to Miller. One of them, Ullman, tells the other named Pavel to take you via car to Black Station so you can all return to Polis. You get to man the machine gun while Pavel drives, and it doesn't take long for you to get ousted as imposters. You shoot your way through the tunnels and then get onto a different railcar to end the mission. You're now on another on-rail shooting section, literally, except this time there's no machine gun. There's a neat detail on this mission. If you kill this guard before he can sound the alarm, then you can pass through the station at normal speed, but if you wait too long, then you'll hit a roadblock and it will move much slower. The timing on this is very precise, and he needs to be dead before he even knows you're coming. The Reich blew one of the tunnels you needed to take, so you take a detour which lands you in prime Nosalis territory. You get through there, and eventually the railcar will run off the track and kill Pavel. You crawl through the drainage pipe the rest of the way and come out near another station that is being constantly attacked by Nosalises. If it seems like you're running into Nosalises 24/7 by this point, then you'd be right. The game does try to balance them out with the stealth sections, but there's a serious lack of enemy variety in the first game, and while the later games are a little better, there still isn't enough to keep these encounters interesting in my opinion. You try to help defend the station from the mutants, but you're eventually knocked unconscious and they manage to break through. Once you regain consciousness, the captain asks you to broadcast a message to Polis and warn them that their defenses failed. You then proceed to walk through a station that is absolutely crawling with lurkers, giving you else something boring to shoot at. Despite my cynicism, this part does manage to keep you on edge and constantly watching your back, which would have been great if I wasn't still dealing with the camera problem. This is remedied a little bit whenever you find a child who is left behind. He rides on your back and will call out when mutants approach you from behind. The two of you travel through the tunnel and meet up with the rest of the survivors where you can reunite him with his mother. She offers you some money as a reward, but I refuse because I was always loaded and I didn't need it. One of the guards informs you that the Reich have built an outpost on the surface and that you'll need to sneak past them to get to Black Station. This is the mission where I ran out of filters for taking too long. You can broadcast the message that the captain gives you, but I didn't have enough time to do that and not suffocate to death, so I decided that it's just a video game and there will be no tangible consequences for letting Polis get blindsided by a horde of mutants. Despite running out of filters, this is another well-crafted level with multiple paths through the environment. The second half was a complete nightmare as I fought through a couple dozen fastest on my way to the objective, but I eventually made it to Black Station. If it feels like I glossed over that mission, it's because there's not really a lot to it, and nothing interesting would have happened if I hadn't run out of filters. You meet up with Ullman and he tells you that he'll be waiting for you at the deserted tunnel to Polis, but you'll need to get through the station alone. You're given the night vision for this quest and directed to shut off the generators to make it easier. I couldn't find the generators, so I decided to make do by shooting out the lights and traveling the lower paths. You will eventually make it to Ullman and take a railcar to Polis. Artyom will fall asleep and you'll get a psychedelic dream of yourself in a dark tunnel. A voice tells you that they want to help you, then the walls blow out and there's a dark one approaching. You hear somebody tell you to run, so you probably do. You then hear Khan's voice saying you can't hide from the future. You finally make it to Polis and Ullman leads you to Miller. You cut back after Artyom explains everything and he says that he's going to call an emergency session for the Polis Council. You're escorted to the council chamber and there's another cut to after the meeting. The council refused to help Exhibition, so Miller proposes a new plan. The Rangers have found several missile bases near Moscow and he proposes raiding the library to find the location of the command center, D6. He says that you need to travel separately to avoid suspicion from the council and you'll rendezvous at the library. You sneak or fight your way past watchmen and demons until you make it to the library courtyard, where even more watchmen arrive. You fend them off until Miller shows up to help you kill them all, and then head into the library. I have one minor criticism about this part that is something I honestly shouldn't have expected to happen in the first place. In the books, it's stated that stalkers who look at the stars of the Kremlin can't look away and are more or less hypnotized into walking towards it, and are never heard from again. It's basically illegal for stalkers to go to the library alone for this reason. This is even confirmed directly whenever Artyom does look at the stars and immediately blacks out. He was saved by one ranger who noticed he was gone. You can hear the same story being told all the way back at Market Station, but if you look at the stars in the game, nothing happens. This only disappoints me because the game has been overwhelmingly true to its source material, and hearing those people tell the story made me immediately want to try it, and nothing happens. I'm pretty sure the reason for this is because you have to fight so many watchmen at the courtyard and it would be annoying to enter a fail state if you happen to pan your camera across it, but I think that this could have been a cool Easter egg if you stared at it for long enough, just like the voices in the pipes. You enter the library and a demon tries to eat you and your squad. Miller tells you to find a way to open the doors upstairs while they try to keep the demons from breaking in. You need to shoot a board that is barricading the door, and you'll be forgiven for not realizing this for a little while because this is one of the only times you have to do something like this. It definitely wasn't the obvious answer when I got to this point. If I'm being honest, I didn't even notice the board was there until several minutes were wasted. Once you're through, you'll get a couple glimpses of some other mutants that are crawling around the library. There's also this nice Easter egg as one of the rangers starts going over some of the books. He comes to one called Roadside Picnic and says something familiar. For those of you who don't know, Roadside Picnic is the story that Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl was inspired by, and as I've mentioned a few times before, the founders of 4A Games worked on that project. This is a neat little way of indirectly referencing their past work. In the next room, you need to shoot down a chandelier to break open a door, and again, you'd be forgiven if you spent more than 5 minutes trying to figure this one out. Miller tells you about the librarians, which are some of the most dangerous mutants in Moscow. If you stare directly into their eyes, then they won't attack, and if you do get into a fight, then you're as good as dead. A demon flies into the building and attacks the other ranger, which forces Miller to take him back to Polis so he can get help. You'll have to find the D6 documents by yourself. He also says there's not much time, dawn's coming, despite it being daytime in the game. I'm not sure if this was because the mission was originally designed to take place at night and they changed it after recording this line, or if it was simply a mistake. It kind of ties into something else about the books you'll hear me mention later, but it's not worth getting into right now. You make your way down to the lower library, and this is when things get very tense. The librarians aren't really that scary, at least not appearance-wise. They're intimidating in their own way, but you'd be hard-pressed to find them scary. There is, however, a true sense of danger during this mission, and it's arguably the most suspenseful mission in the entire franchise. I remember everything about this mission from my first playthrough, including that you could kill a librarian with 2 grenades, but I quickly learned this time that hardcore is built differently, and Miller wasn't lying when he said these things are out of your league. One hit from a librarian is enough to kill you on this difficulty, which means that stealth is the only viable option. There's something unnerving about hearing the librarian on the floor above you, not sure if it's going to drop down right in front of you, or God forbid, right behind you. The slow, clunky camera becomes less of an annoyance and more of an anxiety. If a librarian is behind me, I won't have enough time to turn around. Then there's the several breakable doors in the area, forcing you to spend several seconds with your back turned just to progress. And you're not even in the clear whenever you get to the next floor. Now the anxiety has shifted. I can hear the librarians below me. What happens if they climb up behind me? I'm not kidding whenever I say that I've never been this tense during a mission. Then there are the jump scares that the devs decided to put in. You'll soon realize that even if you think you weren't seen, the librarians know you're here. You reach your first checkpoint and the librarians seal the door behind you. You've been locked in and there's no going back now. You're grabbed by one of them and get a good look at the horrifying beasts that reside here. And judging by how it's guiding you upstairs, you're probably being toyed with by this point. Then you finally do reach the second floor, and it frequently tries to grab you from behind, and while you're trying to stay away from what's actively chasing you, you'll come face to face with another one. Then finally you'll spot the elevator. You'll feel relieved that it's over, except you know this is just the beginning. Artyom whips the camera around faster than I ever could and trips. Thankfully, a demon arrived just in time to try and eat you. You're saved by a librarian, and then another one decides to pay you a visit in the elevator. The only thing keeping this from matching the tension of the gameplay is that it's a cutscene. That didn't stop me from getting cornered in the elevator as another librarian came to give me a mandatory vibe check, and boy was I not vibing. After reloading the checkpoint, making sure not to break eye contact with the librarian since that causes it to start charging you, then you step into the archives. There are far fewer librarians in this area, and you'll find it a lot easier to sneak past them than upstairs. As you make your way through the archives, you'll eventually come to a room full of sleeping librarians. Getting past them is no issue, and you'll find the room where you can search for the D6 documents. Artyom has no problem getting pissed and making noise in this room, despite knowing that the librarians are still sleeping outside, and eventually you find what you're looking for and make a break for the exit. Artyom climbs his way out of the library, but gets jumped by a librarian. That doesn't matter because it gets hit by a car the second it steps outside. Miller says that Khan is the one who helped them find you, and they take you to the ranger base at a local church. You're allowed to fully upgrade your gear for free or trade it in for something else entirely. My dumbass decided to take 2 shotguns, which caused many a problem in the next mission. I died a little on the inside rewatching the footage when I realized that I mistook the hell breath for a flamethrower when it's actually a railgun, and I likely could have avoided the headache altogether. For those of you wondering why I took 2 shotguns, they don't actually label the class of the weapon, so when it said buckshot machine gun, I wasn't entirely sure that it would use shotgun ammo, despite me thinking it most likely did. I kept my other shotgun as a precaution situation and quickly realized that I'm an idiot. I ultimately just accepted it and moved on. You can speak with Khan upstairs, where he basically says, "Think with your mind, punk-ass bitch," and leaves. Once you're ready, you report to Miller and begin the trek to D6. As you ride on yet another type of rail car, Artyom starts hyperventilating and passes out. You have another vision of yourself in a dark tunnel. A voice tells you to keep walking through it, and you can hear Miller calling you from behind. You have your choice of trusting the voice or returning to Miller, and I chose the latter. When you wake up, you find yourself at an airlock. The Rangers try to get it working so you can pass through, and you get assaulted by a horde of Nasalises. Once they're dealt with, a shocky floaty starts approaching. You narrowly get through the gate in an exhilarating sequence that had me on the edge of my seat the entire time, and you find yourself in the tunnel leading to D6. You travel through the dark tunnel as scary piano music plays and Ullman makes shitty joke after shitty joke, which kind of ruins any tension this section is supposed to have. You enter the next room where you fight more Nasalises. Then you get to the next room where you fight more Nasalises. You try to open the door to the next room and a Nasalis jumps you. Boris kills it and a Nasalis jumps him, so he kamikazes himself with a grenade. You mourn the loss of a man you never knew or cared about, then go right back to fighting Nasalises. You move on to the next area and the door slams behind you, and now you get to meet one of the more interesting mutants in the game, spiders. The spiders, which honestly look more like scorpions than anything, can be burned if you shine a direct light onto them, and after a while it'll kill them entirely. You can get through this area without firing a single shot if you manage to keep the light on them, but if you do decide to fight back, then you just need to wait for them to expose their belly since that's the weak point. You make your way through the spider tunnels and regroup with the rest of the team, where they tell you that Stepan died along the way. A tram appears shortly after and you can take it to D6. You arrive there in the next mission and the air is contaminated all over. The place is completely abandoned, as was expected, and your first order of business is trying to get the air filtration system working. The power comes on shortly after and you take the elevator to the command center. Once you make it, the power shuts back off, forcing you and Miller to go down and restart the reactor. You start getting attacked by giant amoebas, and when you make it to the reactor area, you see a giant biomass has grown all over it. Whenever Miller tries to activate the reactor, the biomass starts projectile vomiting at you. The systems are failing, so you need to go operate a crane and activate the reactor manually. The biomass will begin targeting you whenever you do, and you have just enough time to lift all the rods before your crane is destroyed. Once you get it started, you exit the crane and take a lift that loops back to the main floor you arrived at. As you take the lift back up, Miller makes some comments about using the weaponry within D6 to try and reclaim the surface from the mutants. I was originally going to bring up how this directly conflicts with this character in the books, but this game came out before those plot points were even established. Thankfully, Metro Exodus handles this inconsistency perfectly, even if they weren't actually trying to address this scene specifically. You cut back to the beginning of the game right before you fight the horde of Watchmen. You do the fight and once again are attacked by a demon. Miller scares it off with his railgun and you make your way to the tower while the horde is dispersed. I was originally frustrated with this part because I had no ammo, but there is a box where you can restock close by. You fight through more Watchmen until you finally make it to the tower, where you begin your ascent to the top. Miller has the bright idea of destroying the counterweight to an elevator, which miraculously doesn't crush you when it slams into the top. You're attacked by demons as you continue to climb higher up the tower. Eventually, Miller will get wounded by one of the demons and you finally get your chance to kill it. From here, you proceed by yourself, slowly navigating the structure and trying not to die as pieces of it fall apart. You'll start to get visions of the Dark Ones trying to stop you from setting up the guidance system and begin hallucinating entirely after you do set it up. You find yourself in a tunnel and need to navigate it without falling off the edge. You'll be chased by a Dark One as you navigate the mazes of this tunnel, and you'll notice that they are actually trying to force Artyom off the edge of the tower. If you miss a jump in the tunnel, then you get a fail state showing Artyom as he falls off the tower into his death. The sequence ends with Hunter appearing before you, handing you a revolver and telling you the same thing he said in the beginning of the game.
If it's hostile, you kill it.
You shoot the Dark One that's been chasing you, and once you stop hallucinating, you can see its dead body next to the targeting system. You watch as the missiles burn the botanical gardens to the ground, and Artyom monologues.
A wise man once said, "He who leads a war for the love of his fellow men will defeat his enemies." I led my war protecting my family and friends, protecting my home, the Metro. We had won. But to this day, I wonder, when we burned the Dark Ones from the face of the earth, was something lost as well?
This is only one of 2 endings you can get. You'll notice as you play that you're given several choices throughout the course of the story. Do you kill your enemies or incapacitate them? Do you accept the woman's reward for saving her son or turn her down? Do you trust the voices in the dream and do as they say, or return to Miller as he calls you back? All of these will cause you to gain or lose morality points and dictate which ending you see. The canon ending is also considered the bad one, which is the one I got. The good ending has you shooting the Dark One when Hunter gives you the revolver and hearing the quote Khan told you back in the church.
You reap what you sow, Artyom. Force answers force. War breeds war, and death only brings death. To break this vicious circle, one must do more than just act without any thought or doubt.
The Dark One wasn't killed by this shot, and you shoot the targeting system afterwards. Artyom then gives a different monologue, which goes like this.
H.G. Wells once wrote, "If we don't end wars, wars will end us." And somehow, I stopped my war. At the time, I couldn't say what had made me spare the Dark Ones. But I came to realize that the strange visions that haunted my journey were their attempts to reach out to us. I don't know if I was the first to communicate with them, but I will not be the last. They are among us now. And the future, our future, stretches before us like an endless metro tunnel.
There have been several hints throughout the games that the Dark Ones aren't the threat that they were perceived as. The way that it doesn't hurt you in the first vision back in the tunnel to Riga, it helps save you in Bourbon in the tunnel to Market Station, it shows you what life used to be like before the war, and you hear them repeatedly saying that they want to help humanity. Khan's last words are pretty heavy-handed. It's clear that he has some sort of insight as to what's going on, and he's trying to steer Artyom towards sparing the Dark Ones. I'm going to save my opinion on the Dark Ones as a whole until later because it'll be much more relevant for that dreaded book discussion that I've been hyping up for the entire video. So here are my thoughts on Metro 2033 as a whole. I think that this game is the most tonally consistent in the entire franchise. The game manages to maintain its dark and dreary atmosphere from beginning to end, and just the unease that comes with traveling alone through the metro was enough to keep me on edge for most of the game. The library is when the game peaks in tension, and you won't get to experience anything like it until the end of Metro Exodus, and unfortunately it doesn't last long enough to really have the same impact. The gunplay can feel a little awkward at times, but I found it to be mostly reliable even if the camera was slow. The story strikes a good balance in that it doesn't take a back seat to the gameplay, but it doesn't get in the way of it either, which is something that the franchise is very good at. Overall, I think Metro 2033 is the most solid experience in all of its areas: stealth, combat, survival elements, atmosphere and horror, and story. The later games do some of these better, but they aren't as consistent with them as this game. I think it's for that reason that people generally regard Metro 2033 as the best game in the franchise, and they're right to think so. So, if this game is the best, then that would mean the franchise could only decline from here, right?
Well, I used to live nearby. Before the war, up there. I was on the train when it happened. I tried calling my family, but couldn't get through.
Metro Last Light was released in May of 2013 to generally positive reviews. The main complaints were that the enemy AI was too simple and the bosses too frustrating. Most of us won't be able to experience the difference in AI because the original version of Metro 2033 has been replaced with the Redux, and I don't think many people would opt for the original today anyways. I think that Last Light does have too many shooting gallery sections, but as I mentioned before, the game kept me stocked on ammo, so the only thing I had to manage were my health kits. I think that this is a fair balance because managing your health is much more difficult than managing your ammo, and I got to learn in Exodus just how frustrating it can be when the game forces you into mandatory shooting sections without giving you the ammo to deal with them. You could consider this a weakness in the game's survival elements, but it was necessary for the game to include so many areas that force you to waste so much ammo, which brings us to the boss fights. Here's a 5-second review of every boss in the game. They suck. I'll talk about each one individually when we get to their fight, but they're not interesting. The bosses in Exodus are far worse, but I honestly think that the only enjoyable boss in Last Light is the bear, and that's because it keeps you actively involved in the fight and offers some cool bullet time parts that require you to shoot its weak points, even if the game basically tells you what to do. They also come far too close to each other. Two of them are basically one level apart, and if you consider the red square sequence to be a puzzle boss, then they appear back to back twice, as if the devs were trying to cram these encounters together before the end of the game. Thankfully, the build-up to these encounters are handled really well, and it really goes to show how good the guys at 4A are at creating an atmosphere that puts the player on edge, although I never felt that way throughout the entire playthrough like I did in the first game. I think the reason for this was because I already felt comfortable with the setting and its quirks, so it had a lot less impact than it did in the first game. But then there's that ending part of Metro Exodus that shows how simple the answer to this problem is: just introduce something new. Give the player an unfamiliar threat that they don't know how to deal with, or put them in a hostile environment that keeps them on their toes, which is exactly how the build-up to those bosses function. Besides that, most of my experience with Last Light was mostly positive, and I think it's a worthy sequel to Metro 2033. With that being said, let's get into the game's story. You may recall earlier when I said that Last Light isn't directly related to Metro 2034, and I'm glad that it isn't. The guys at 4A all agreed that the book's plot wouldn't translate into a game very well, so they decided to go in another direction. That's good news for me, because that means I don't need to struggle with what information about the books are worth including in this section and which aren't. It was very difficult for me to discuss the last game without interjecting book details every 5 seconds. With Last Light, I can talk about the game by itself and not worry about how it compares to the novels. Last Light begins with another cutscene before you access the menu screen. This one talks about the time that Artyom convinced his friends to explore an abandoned station and try to explore the surface when they were kids. You learn from Artyom that both of his friends, one of which is Eugene, are now dead. It's not said in-game, but Eugene is killed by Dark Ones before Artyom had a chance to stop them. Take a guess where I got that information. Artyom can't remember what his mother looked like, so he wanted to explore the botanical gardens in hopes of remembering something, since it was the last place that they were before the city was nuked. She died shortly after they took shelter in the metro. He also makes the comment that he would sell his soul just to remember what she looked like, and then says that he did. The cutscene continues with Artyom explaining how the Dark Ones came from that same station to the botanical gardens. Artyom and his friends had tried to shut the door, but it jammed, allowing the Dark Ones to make it into the metro. He proceeds to talk about how the Dark Ones were said to be unspeakably evil and could rip grown men apart with their bare hands, and that it was all lies. The game starts with you sitting around a campfire singing that campfire song. One of them is talking about his life before the war, and you hear gunfire in the distance. Several Dark Ones approach, and whenever they attack, your squad turns into a pack of Nosalises. You don't find out until after you killed the last one that you were hallucinating, and then you collapse in front of a Dark One. You wake up after to find Khan in your room. He tells you that he saw that one of the Dark Ones had survived the bombing. Ullman walks in the room and starts telling Khan to leave, and he says that you need to go find the Dark One and try to speak with it. Ullman says that he's taking you and Khan to see Miller, but it's obvious by the way he's talking that he has no idea how Khan managed to get into their base. Khan proceeds to lecture Ullman about the dangers of smoking because it's in his nature to piss off as many people as humanly possible. You'll quickly learn that the Order has taken up residence in D6 and are using it as their base of operations. You pick your loadout from the armory and make your way to see Miller. You hear about somebody named Lesnitsky who ransacked a lab full of chemical weapons and escaped the bunker. Khan tells you that the bombing of the Dark Ones was the worst mistake that you could have made, and that it was possible that they were only trying to communicate, and their presence was what drove people insane. Spoiler alert, he's right. Khan tells Miller that he found a surviving Dark One, and Miller agrees to let you go with him to find it. He also says he's sending his best sniper, Anna, and has Khan detained when he tries to argue that killing the Dark One is murder. Khan tells Artyom that this is his last chance for forgiveness and his only way to get rid of the nightmares he's been having, then the guards escort him out of the room. Miller believes that Khan has lost his mind after getting too close to the Dark One and sends you to kill it. He says to get back to D6 quickly because war is coming and he needs every available ranger at the base. As you make your way out, Miller says that he believes Lesnitsky was a sleeper agent, but he isn't sure who he was working for. Unfortunately, we need to talk about Anna. I'd say I don't like her in this game, but that's kind of the point. She's written to be insufferable, but a lot of her lines are more awkward than irritating. The way she repeatedly calls you rabbit comes off as more childish than demeaning, and it's very obvious that Glukhovsky wanted you to dislike her at this point of the story. I will defend this decision by saying that Anna is a massive bitch in Metro 2035, so you could argue this is perfectly in character for her, but it still feels very forced. It's not even that it's poorly written. She does have some good lines, like how she ridicules Artyom for even thinking that you could make peace with the Dark Ones, but every other time she opens her mouth, it just makes me cringe.
With looking at my ass, it's way out of your reach, rabbit.
I can't say I've ever been religious, but right now I'm begging all gods, please, make Anna be silent.
You learn during the loading screen, which is the only time you'll ever hear Artyom talk in game, that this takes place 1 year after the events of Metro 2033. I didn't mention the loading screen monologues in the last game because most of them were just a recap of what you just did and some vague foreshadowing, but they offer a lot more detail in Last Light and Exodus. You make your way through the tunnels until you find a ladder to the top. Anna continues to make me cringe with her childish insults and then compliments you on killing an entire species. You fight off some watchmen, which forces her to acknowledge that I know what the fuck I'm doing, and you head into the scorched remains of the botanical gardens. You find the surviving Dark One and see that it's just a child. Anna shoots it before I get a chance to because I couldn't see it, and it blocks her shot. I laugh at her for having an SR in the triple digits and continue chasing the Dark One. She manages to wound it, and after grabbing it, you get to see some of its memories. It was far enough away from the nest to avoid the missile strike, but all the others were killed. You wake up just in time to see some soldiers have captured the Dark One, and they speak German to you right before knocking you out again. I don't know, it might be the Reds. You wake up in a cell with 3 other prisoners. 2 of them are Reds, and the third was captured for being a suspected mutant. They ultimately determine that he is and shoot him in the head. The first communist is shot for refusing to talk, and the second one says that he'll tell them everything, but he wants to do so in private. The man says that normally the Reich doesn't interfere with the Order's business, but considering you were caught with 2 Reds and a Dark One, he's going to make an exception. The other Red attacks the guard near him, and you choke out the officer that was interrogating you. He cuts you free and hands you the knife, then basically says that he doesn't care about politics and he just wants to work together to escape, making him my boy for the rest of the game. You and Pavel escape through the garbage chute because everybody knows that the best prison cells are built with an exit in mind, and you learn that the prison is basically rigged to be a giant gas chamber in case of a riot. This functions as your sneaking tutorial, and it's where you basically learn to stick to the shadows and turn off lights. In the last game, all you could do was turn off lamps and torches, but now you can unscrew light bulbs, so you don't need to shoot them out. You proceed through the prison until you reach the top, where you have the choice of releasing all the prisoners for some morality points, or just ignoring them if you're gunning for the bad ending. You and Pavel steal some Reich uniforms and start making your way through a crowd as they listen to the Fuhrer speak. You learn that they're planning to attack D6. There's supposedly enough food and medicine there to support an army, so it's no wonder that they want it so badly. A guard comes in and says that 2 prisoners have escaped, and Pavel fires a shot in the air to distract them so you can move through. He probably could have shot the Fuhrer himself and had the same impact, but that would also have probably forced everybody to attack at once, so it makes sense that he didn't try it. He can't reload a save like we can. You and Pavel roll through an airlock like badasses, but Artyom is dummy thick, so he's already out of breath. Pavel helps you reach the rail car, and you shoot the soldiers as they try to get through the gate. You're just fine at the start of the next level since the shots you took hit your body armor. Pavel goes crawling through a drainage pipe to try and find a way out of the tunnel you escaped to, and he's quickly caught by the Reich's guards. Artyom isn't willing to leave the commie bastard behind, so we need to sneak around and try and save him. I think I've already mentioned enough how good the level design is in these games, and Last Light is no exception. You make it to Pavel's cell just in time for the guards to take him away to be executed. I picked up the suppressed lowlife with a stock and grip, and I shit you not, I carried this thing around as my stealth weapon until the very end of the game. I have never found something so reliable since the combat shotgun in Fallout 3. You get to Pavel just as the executioners hang him and cut him down after killing them. Pavel's lucky that he's such a bro, because if it was any other communist, I would have left him there. You escape through a nearby tunnel, and the Wolfensteins decide to cut the lights instead of pursuing you, saying that you'll be dead anyways. It doesn't take long for you to find out what they were talking about. The tunnel you're passing through leads directly into the heart of a spider nest, and as I mentioned before, the spiders will die if exposed to the light for too long. Pavel tells you to shine your light on them until they expose their belly and then shoot them, which is a hell of a lot more information than the nothing you got in the last game. Once you're out of the tunnels, you'll need to cross the surface to make it to the nearby station. You grab a gas mask off the table and head outside. The ice on the surface is thawing as spring approaches, which means there's totally not going to be a shitty swamp section later in the game. You come to a crash plane that's full of ghosts and begin hallucinating as you witness the pilot's final moments before the crash. Pavel took off his mask during the vision, so you save his life for a second time in a row. You'll then need to fight through a pack of watchmen to reach the station, and narrowly escape before being mauled to death. This puts you less than an hour away from Polis as long as Pavel keeps his word and helps get you through the red line. Before you part ways, he wants to have a few drinks in honor of your not dying together, so you stop by the bar before heading forward. He was even nice enough to set the table in advance. He talks to you about politics for a moment, saying how most of the rumors about the Red Line are embellished and that the rest of the metro lacks order. He says that he's communist red through and through, and you both finish your drinks. But now we have a problem. Pavel started hanging out with his other friends, and he decided that he doesn't want to play with us anymore. He had them spike your drink before you arrived, and he tells you that he's just doing his job to protect the Red Line. This is actually a very effective betrayal because the writers didn't signpost it at every turn. You've saved each other's lives several times by this point, and even when I knew this was coming, I couldn't help but like his character. A lot of games tend to make the player character extremely naive when the betrayal is obviously coming, but this one will likely blindside you just like it does Artyom. When you come to, you're being escorted by the commies. Pavel tells you that he really does think of you as a friend, but as a soldier, he's obligated to follow his orders above all else. You've been brought here because of what you know. The Reds plan on besieging D6, and he wants you to join the Reds and help them take it. You're introduced to General Corbett, who is accompanied by Lesnitsky. He tells them who you are, and you're taken to the interrogation room. Corbett tells you that if you tell him everything you know about the Dark One, then he'll let you live and send you back to the Rangers as a communist spy. Comrade Moscovin, the leader of the Reds, comes in so he can teach his bitch of a son, Lenya, a thing or two about interrogation. Moscovin says to hell with the truth serum and decides to just beat the information out of you. This upsets Lenya because he has a conscience, and he runs out of the room crying. Moscovin gets pissed and chases after him, proving once again that communists can't do anything right. Corbett doesn't believe in using brutality to get information, and he prefers the method of injecting you with rushed, barely tested COVID vaccines instead. This causes you to black out and have a flashback to when Artyom and company visit the surface as children. You're rescued by a Dark One after being attacked by a pack of watchmen, and you hear Corbett tell Pavel to go to a station called Venice and speak with some people who made a delivery. He also says that the information about the Dark One is in an envelope he's carrying, and then you black out again. I don't know why Corbett decided to say all this in front of you, but I suppose he thought that there was no way you could escape anyways. You black out for a second time and wake up to find Lenya in your cell. He hates Corbett, Moscovin, Pavel, and communism as a whole, so he decides to set you free. This goes a long ways towards making him likable in Metro 2034, but he's also a pathological liar in the books who almost caused the mass extermination of an entire station just to get into a girl's pants. So you'll be forgiven if you don't find this one act of selflessness very convincing. For that reason, I will not be making Lenya a member of the boys. You escape through a ventilation shaft and overhear Corbett talking with Moscovin, where you learn that Corbett is really the one in charge here. He's the one who helped kill Moscovin's brother so he can usurp his position, and he's been controlling Moscovin ever since. You begin your escape from the Reds and will eventually get ambushed by none other than Andrew the Blacksmith. He's been helping evacuate people from the Red Line, and he gives you a rail car to make your way back to the Order. There are plenty of lights on it, so you don't need to worry about the spiders unless you enter some of the side tunnels without it, which you do. You'll need to slowly push a train car while a pack of watchmen attack from behind until you get it out of the way, then proceed forward. You'll come across some refugees who have been attacked by bandits in the tunnel ahead. You can try to save some of them as you move forward for some morality points. I tried to do to these bandits who were trying to rape a woman what Ullman did to the Wolfensteins when you were captured in the last game, but it took too long, so they ended up killing her for struggling too much. After reloading a save, I just shot him. You'll eventually come to a junction in the tracks. One of them has a bunch of fires, skulls, and spikes all over the place, and the other is perfectly normal. The scary-looking one is the correct path, and the other is a trap. After a slight detour to save more women and children, you can proceed forward. You ram a barricade, which knocks the railcar off its tracks, so you proceed on foot. This next section is the part I mentioned at the beginning of the video, where you need to wait for the fishermen to arrive while a horde of Nasalises attack you. This took me several tries, but I eventually got through it. Since the snow on the surface has been melting, flooded stations are becoming more and more common, and it's made way for a new business of fishermen. Pretty soon, you'll be introduced to my brethren.
Nobody knows what they mutated for. We call them shrimps.
They're beautiful. More beautiful than anything I've ever laid eyes on. One of my brothers tries to give me a kiss, but Artyom still clings on to his unrealistic standards of beauty and ultimately refuses. There was nothing I could do but cry from behind my monitor. The rest of the shrimps were as outraged as I was. We don't take too kindly to murderers in the shrimposphere, and I was forced to fight back. I tried to spare as many of them as possible, but they kept spitting on Artyom, and I had to decide between my people and completing the game. I did what needed to be done, and then they did the unthinkable. Artyom handed the fishermen a box full of dynamite. They lit all of them at once and threw it in the water. There was an explosion, and it was as if 1,000 shrimps all cried out, and then were silenced. The deed was done, but I was disgusted with myself. In Venice, you're basically told that the place is run by the local gangs, and one of the younger citizens wants to storm the storage facility they're gathering at and kill them all. I like the idea, but the local leader doesn't. You're also told that there's literally no way for you to leave the station since the tunnels are either flooded or just too dangerous to travel through. The leader basically says, "Welcome to your new life," and tries to give you a job. But little does he know that A-Man and I are the protagonist of a video game, so there's always another way out. You find Pavel in the local brothel refusing to pay the escorts, because according to the laws of communism, that's our body. You listen in on Pavel's conversation to learn that they've delivered a virus container to Oktyabrskaya. A random whore starts talking to you while you're eavesdropping, so you grab her and hide in one of the nearby tents, then signal for her to be quiet. You let her go once the coast is clear, and she offers to give you a lap dance, but I decided to turn her down. The distant clapping of Pavel's dummy-thick ass cheeks reverberated the siren call of revenge, and there was nary a moment to lose. You sneak through the storage room full of thugs and lowlives, killing the occasional one that's in your way, then come to the room where Pavel and the gang leader were talking. The leader is dead, and Pavel has you at gunpoint. He gets distracted by a noise and you gain the upper hand, pinning him to a wall with your knife. He tells you the Dark One is at Oktyabrskaya and that he can take you there, except he promises not to trick you again. Artyom gets distracted by a noise when the young guy from earlier busts in, and Pavel uses this as an opportunity to escape. He's mad that you didn't invite him to join in on the fun, but he also knows a way up to the surface. You just need to cross the swamp. You're given a protective suit and then head on out. Alright guys, welcome to today's episode of Salty Shrimp Biases. I hate swamps. I think they're really cool in real life, and I've enjoyed taking airboat tours in Louisiana in the past. One time the tour guide got off our boat and walked up to an alligator nest, and I was convinced that I was about to watch a man die, but I hate swamps in video games. Velen from The Witcher 3, least favorite region in the game. Literally any swamp from any From Software game, they suck. The Metro games are no exception to this, and I think the boating sections from Exodus are some of my least favorite, except for one at the very end of the game. The marshes in Last Light have a real sense of danger, but most of it comes from trying to traverse it without falling into the water. Swamps are a concept that you'd think would have a lot of potential in video games. They have a large amount of biodiversity, most of it is flooded, and you have to watch out for things that look like solid ground but are actually just floating bits of dirt and grass, and these are real dangers that you would need to account for while traversing it. Last Light and Exodus do all of these things, but I cannot get past the fact that I fundamentally don't like swamp levels in games and didn't enjoy this section whatsoever. They're like underwater levels in games that aren't really designed for them. Everybody likes the concept, but nobody likes the execution. Anybody who's dealt with the sharks in Call of Duty Ghosts knows exactly what I'm talking about. Now that I'm done explaining why I dislike this otherwise very creative and well-crafted level, let's move on. You need to get gas for the ferry so you can cross the swamp and meet up with the rangers at the church. You're told that you can find gas at either the gas station or the crashed plane, and it's not at the gas station. That would make too much sense. You dodge demons, shrimps, and other hazards as you make your way there, then the plane is attacked by a larger species of shrimp, simply called the bog shrimp. The bog shrimp attacks again, probably because it heard what you and the fisherman got up to in the tunnels and has come to deliver justice for the war crimes we committed. You fight it off and ride the ferry to the other side. It's already dark by the time you arrive, and there are some NVGs that can be found if you look for them. Anna can be heard over the radio telling you to make your way to the church, and you'll get attacked by the bog shrimp again. Whether or not this is the same one is unclear, but the odds are it probably isn't. You fight it off, run around for 5 or 10 minutes until you realize that you won't drown if you try to walk through the water towards the building. You know, since they have one of those flag posts in the middle of it, like every other walkable surface in the swamp, I miss that on every single playthrough. You make it to the church and get attacked again, except now it's a boss fight. There's literally nothing to this encounter except running around and filling it with every ounce of ammo that you have until it's dead. It's not very interesting if I'm being honest. Once you're inside, Anna apologizes for letting you get captured in the beginning of the game. You get ready to head through the church catacombs whenever Lesnitsky shows up and blows the door open. He kidnaps Anna, so now it's your job to save her. Your trek through the catacombs has you fighting Nosalises at every turn, some of which can survive 2 point-blank shots to the face from a shotgun. I've already talked about how I don't like these sections of the game, so there's no need to bring it back up. What I will bring up is our next boss fight, a giant Nosalis called the Big Mama. Here's how you win this fight. Pretend to be a matador and lower into the pillars of stone. Once you've broken enough of them, you'll be in another room full of more pillars. Do the exact same thing until there are no supports left, then shoot her 1 or 2 times to finish the job. This boss fight comes too soon after the last one to really have any impact, and even then, I don't think it's very interesting. All the support breaking caused the roof to collapse and the water to start filling the room, and you're swept away in the flood and spat out in a nearby tunnel. You manage to catch up with Lesnitsky and gang, and you learn after saving a dying man that the Reds knew about the pandemic the station is suffering from before anybody had even died yet, which means they're the ones who released the virus and they're burning down the station to cover it up. You sneak or fight your way through Oktyabrskaya until you find the man who took Anna. You can refuse to shoot or try to kill the guy holding her, but even if you shoot him, his helmet will prevent you from killing him. He'll push her onto you, which will break your gas mask, infecting you with the plague. You make it to the neighboring station before suffocating, and Khan is waiting for you. I'd say it's pretty convenient that Khan happened to be at the station, but considering it's Khan, I think we can all just accept it. And like I said before, Glukovsky is no stranger to coincidences in his stories. You and Anna need to quarantine, which is something we should all be familiar with at this point in time. You finally get to see Anna in regular clothes with 4A's disturbingly realistic boob physics, and as you can tell by the way she just makes herself at home on your lap, she's decided that she's ready to open up to you. She confides in you a little, and then you confide in her a little more literally. I'm just gonna say it, you and Anna fuck. The doctor comes in afterwards to tell you that you're not going to die from Atrovid-34. You overhear some physicians who say the plague was a strain of Ebola, except it has slowly become less and less deadly as time went on. Between the second and third days of infection, the mortality rate had dropped from 95% to 25%, and by now, it's basically inert. This wasn't a regular strain of Ebola, it was a bioweapon that was designed to be extremely deadly for a short amount of time and then become harmless within a span of a week. This is what Lesnitsky took from D6 and brought to the Reds. You meet up with Khan, and he says that you need to work on finding the Dark One. He tells you that a peace summit is being held at Polis, and that war is inevitable regardless of what happens. He's taking you to something called the River of Fate that is supposed to help you find the Dark One. You follow him to a flooded area that sends you back in time whenever you launch the missiles at the end of the last game. You're then teleported to the moment you chase the Dark One at the start of this game, and it gets away from you despite the fact that you could easily catch it if you were given a prompt. You then find yourself on a burning train that crashes, preventing you from reaching the Dark One in time. Once you leave the river, since you were basically drowning that entire time, you make your way to a nearby railcar and try to locate the train you saw in the last vision. This puts you in another on-rails section where you kill the Reds who are in control of it. Khan channels the power of God and anime when he blows up a railcar in front of you with a single shot of his revolver, proving once again that he found the secret dev room and stole a debug weapon. You jump onto the train without dying and fight your way to the Dark One's cage. It once again gives you a vision of the past whenever you touch it. Now it's time for yet another did not happen in the book moment. We cut back to the cutscene from before where the Dark One saved Artyom from the Watchmen. It uses its brain magic to show Artyom his mother, then Steve Blum gives his best JC Denton impersonation.
You're not alone. You're the first.
The Dark One you saved says that the rest of his species waited for you after that day, and then you killed them all. Communicating with you exhausted him, and Artyom carries him out of the wrecked train. He regains his energy whenever you bring him to the surface and says that he'll stay close to you. He gives you the thermal vision and slows down time whenever some Watchmen attack you in the fog. The Watchmen call you a no-skill pussy for using thermal and hardcore and find a new lobby where they can project their insecurities on the next person who beats them. You basically spend the next 45 minutes or so running around the surface while the Dark One tries to get a better understanding of humanity. You'll learn as you travel with him that the Dark Ones have the ability to sense emotions and can tell if something is hostile or not. Keep that in mind because it'll be very important for something I have to say later. You pass through another stealth section where you're eventually jumped by Lesnitsky. The Dark One shows you his memories where you learn that he basically has no regrets for anything that he did and is all around just a shitty person. You're given the choice to kill or spare him, and I chose to spare him only to prove that it doesn't give enough morality points to outweigh the hundreds of people I've stabbed on this run. You leave him unconscious on the surface without a gas mask, so he'll probably end up suffocating and dying anyways, which makes me wonder how that's better than just killing him now. Pavel and his communist dogs are going to be at the Red Square, so that's where you're going next. You pass through a tunnel full of hands that are trying to grab you. The Dark One explains that these souls are lonely and are desperate to trap somebody else with them. You get through safely thanks to your mutant buddy and make it to the Red Square. Pavel recognizes you on sight and orders his men to kill you. This is actually a really difficult encounter on hardcore since you take a lot of damage, so using cover is required. Once you open fire, the Dark One will give you thermal vision, once again pissing off the FaZe fanboys in the lobby. Once you've dealt with the losers on the outside, you make your way to Pavel. He takes several shots before going down, and he can light you up if you're not careful. The Dark One tells you that he's not feeling hostility towards you, he's just feeling sadness and upset that you need to fight. You find him on the ground without a filter in his gas mask, and the Dark One once again shows you his thoughts. The screen is flashing red because I was critically damaged and out of health kits. You learn that the Reds plan to capture D6 and release the virus on the entire Metro to force everybody to accept communism. This would be the second time in the Metro's history when the Reds attempt a hostile takeover like this, but you don't learn that in the game. You cut back to the Red Square to see Pavel being trapped by the Soul Hands, and you're given the choice to help him or leave him to die. I'm not sure what decision most people made here, but I've never felt comfortable leaving him to die. Lesnitsky was a bastard who deserved everything coming to him, but Pavel is much more humanized, and I've always been willing to forgive him. He's a perfect example of a legitimately good person who does terrible things for the sake of his ideology, but other than refusing to pay some hookers, I don't think that he's shown to be inherently evil. I could never bring myself to let him die, and I was happy to see him reincarnated as a different character in Exodus. Hey, so do you guys like bears, and do you like boss fights? Well, if you answered no to both of those questions, then boy are you in for a treat, because up next we have a bear fight. By strategically teaming up with a group of watchmen, who don't tear you apart for some reason, you can bring down this giant mutated bear. Shoot it until it gets staggered, wait for the bitey boys to jump on its back, and then shoot its back in bullet time until it runs off. It's literally the best boss in the entire franchise, and it's still boring. You can decide to save the bear from the Watchmen afterwards, but I didn't know that was an option, so I left her to die. Her cubs will probably die too, but hey, that's life. You make it to the Ranger outpost and the Dark One disguises himself as a little boy. Whenever he finally reveals himself, Khan is in awe and Miller is mortified. He gives you and Khan a vision that shows Dark Ones hibernating in D6. Don't ask me why or how they got into an underground bunker that hasn't been opened since before the Dark Ones even existed, because I don't have an answer for you. This specific door is located near Exhibition, which makes even less sense because if you look at a map of the Metro, Exhibition is here, and D6 is here. It's possible that there are Metro 2 tunnels leading to D6 since we don't have a map of it, but the bunker itself is still way too far for there to be a door underneath Exhibition. I'm going to try and theorize how this could be possible. The Dark Ones enter the Metro from the Botanical Gardens, find a Metro 2 tunnel that leads behind this door at D6, and potentially lose consciousness the way the Dark One did when you saved him. He says it's hard for them to breathe in the tunnels and the sunlight gives him energy. They probably went into hibernation to avoid dying. There's no real explanation for this beyond that, and I typically try to avoid making up answers to questions like this, but at least it makes some amount of sense. Just for the record, Metro 2 does exist in real life, and its codename is D6, but in the context of the Metro universe, they're two different things entirely. The Dark One agrees to help you stop the war that's coming to D6 if you open the door to release the rest of his species. You travel to the peace conference being held at Polis, and the Dark One lets you see Moscovin's memories. You see how Corbett deceived him into murdering his brother by telling him that his life was in danger, and then used this as blackmail to seize power. You hear about his remorse for his actions despite him not fully realizing that Corbett lied to him. When you wake back up, you see that Moscovin had been saying all these things out loud, and then confesses that Corbett is marching on D6 as we speak. It becomes apparent to everyone that Moscovin is just a figurehead, and that there's nothing he can do to stop the invasion. You drop off the Dark One on your way to the bunker, and get ready to defend it against the Reds. If you've been collecting the journal entries, then you'll learn that there was never any food or medical supplies in D6. Miller only ever found biological weapons hidden away, and he never told anybody to prevent exactly what's happening now. Corbett only cares about controlling the entire Metro, so he let everybody believe that the Order was sitting on a mountain of resources and refused to share with them. Now comes the final mission, the battle for D6. This was the worst part of the game for me because of how quickly you can die, and it took me several attempts. The Reds use a train to blow open the airlock to D6, then you need to fight off a horde of enemies. You need to disable a tank, but you're only allowed to shoot the glowing parts. You can't take out the gunner despite having a shot on them, and it took me far longer to kill this thing than it had any right to. After that, you get your first and only Juggernaut in the game, taking cover behind a group of soldiers with shields. The Juggernaut takes way too many shots to kill, and I refuse to believe that anybody can survive an entire magazine of sniper shots to the head, no matter how thick the metal in that helmet is. The impact of the bullet alone would be enough to give you a concussion and possibly break your neck in the process. I'm not a ballistics expert, but it started to feel a little bit ridiculous, and this isn't an issue specific to Metro. Any game with people that take entire magazines to die outside of Fallout bothers me. Eventually, the Reds will ram another train through the blockade and kill almost everybody. Miller loses his legs, and Artyom landed near a switch that triggers the explosives they set in the bunker. Their last line of defense was to blow the place to hell so nobody could access the weapons. You turn the switch, killing you and everybody else in the bunker. You then see Anna telling this story to a child, which, spoiler alert, is yours, and she says that the Dark Ones left Moscow to try and repopulate, but they promise to be back someday. As you can imagine, this is the bad ending, but it's also the better one in my opinion. The canon ending has the Dark Ones appearing and stopping you from turning the switch. They kill all the commie bastards in D6, and you learn that Ullman died. Miller became the leader of the Polis Guard, but is confined to a wheelchair, and Khan outright disappeared. The little Dark One tells Artyom that he'll be back someday, and then they all leave. This ending is also good, but I honestly prefer the haha gotcha bitch vibes of the other one. And with that, we're finished with Metro Last Light. As you can probably tell by the way the story plays out, the game's main theme is redemption. Artyom had doubts in the last game about whether it was right to kill the Dark Ones, and this game was about righting those wrongs and gaining forgiveness from those that he killed. I think Last Light is a much better action game than 2033, but its horror elements weren't as impactful despite being even more present. I've heard some people regard this as the weakest game in the franchise, and while I don't necessarily agree, I'm not necessarily itching to replay it either. I would say that the gameplay is the same level of quality as the last game, and the story is slightly less interesting but still enjoyable. However, the characters are much more memorable, and Pavel will go down in my mind as my favorite frenemy of any game. It probably helps that I don't have many things to compare that to anyways. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for, and that I've been hyping up more than the first 7 seasons of Game of Thrones, let's talk about these damn books already. Obviously, I don't have gameplay footage from the books because they're archaic and don't have HDMI ports, so I'll just be playing random footage in the background that is somewhat related to the topic at hand. Let's start out with the obvious problem these books have, the English translation. As you can probably tell by the fact that I'm speaking English right now, it's my first language. I do not habla español, sprechen Sie Deutsch, and I certainly do not govori po-ruski. I have a friend I know who lives in Russia and speaks both languages fluently, and I can confirm that these languages do not work well together. It's almost poetic how the US and Russia have such a long history of mixing about as well as oil and water, and then learning that our languages are no different. Most of what I know regarding this subject comes from that friend I mentioned, and I know that doesn't sound like a reliable source, but when it comes to a discussion about a certain language, I don't think you can go wrong by running things by somebody who is a native speaker of it. From what I've gathered, there are a number of things that don't work out when trying to translate Russian to English. Russia uses the Cyrillic alphabet that has different grammatical rules than the Latin alphabet, so right off the bat, we're at a disadvantage. You then need to take into account how the words are pronounced, since that can change the meaning quite significantly, and if you're not a professional translator or a native speaker of both languages, a lot of the translation can feel rigid or unnatural, which is exactly how the books feel. Here's an example. You all know Miller by this point in time. Well, Miller's name in the first book is Milnik, which is short for somebody who works on a milnitsa, which, as you can probably guess, is Russian for windmill. Something as fundamental as a name is subject to change depending on its meaning. You're probably thinking, okay, but that makes sense. Both of those words mean windmill, so the name reflects that. It isn't that complicated. Well, you're wrong, because somehow Zhenya, Artyom's best friend, translates to fucking Eugene, and neither I nor my Russian buddy have any clue how that works. To be fair, I got this information from the wiki, and it could simply be wrong, and Foray could have just changed his name to Eugene, like how they changed Artyom's stepfather, whose name in the books is Suhoy, to Alex. But if this is true, then it's also the perfect example of how convoluted this task is. The reason I'm explaining all of this now is because a lot of the general clunkiness between these books can be excused if you understand that Russian and English do not translate that well. That same friend of mine also said that he has issues with the Russian language pack for Disco Elysium because it relies too heavily on the use of slang compared to the English version, and it changes the tone of most conversations. There were a good number of times I was reading Metro 2033, and I could think of several different ways that a sentence could be better phrased, and after a week, I was actively rewording things on the fly or focusing more on what they were trying to say than how they said it. A good example is early in the story, when Artyom and Bourbon are traveling together. The same supernatural force that Artyom experienced on the way to Riga was making another appearance, and just like before, it was having less of an effect on Artyom. They both start experiencing mood swings, hearing strange music, and generally have no control over their emotions. I'm going to read this part now, and hopefully you can see what I'm talking about. Suddenly he stopped and turned his head to the left so sharply that Artyom could hear how his vertebrae cracked, and he looked Artyom straight in the eye. Artyom started and stepped backwards, groping for his machine gun just in case. Bourbon looked at it with wide-open eyes, but his pupils were contracted into two tiny dots, even though in the pitch-black darkness of the tunnel they should have been thrown open to their limits in an attempt to capture as much light as possible. His face seemed unnaturally peaceful. Not one muscle was tense, and there was even a contemptuous smile which had just disappeared from his lips. "I've died," Bourbon said. "There is no more me," and as straight as a cross tie, he fell face down. There are several problems with this one example. First, the use of commas is very inconsistent. This is a problem that all the stories have, but it's the worst in this book, and it essentially makes everything feel like a run-on sentence. You may also have noticed that I said the word "and" twice, and that's because the word was written twice. Repeated words are a common error in the books, and it makes it seem like they didn't go through an editor for the English version. Lastly, the phrasing of what Bourbon said is just off. When I first read the words, "there is no more me," I immediately started thinking of a more natural way you could say that. A more common phrase would be to say, "I am no more," or "I'm a goner." This is more of an issue with the translation than it is the writing, and it's the most abundant problem. The best way to describe how these books are written is to compare it to a game that you can't put down, but it's riddled with bugs. I haven't read many books since I've never been much of a reader, but I think Metro 2033 is my favorite so far. But that doesn't change how god-awful it is to try and read. There are a multitude of misspellings, repeated words, the entire book uses apostrophes where quotation marks go, and vice versa. They refer to Artyom's stepfather as his grandfather early on, and I had to reread it 5 times just to make sure it was a mistake, and as you saw, the phrasing is really awkward at times. But just like that buggy game, if you can train yourself to correct the errors as you see them, you'll realize that the writing itself is amazing. Artyom's journey through the metro is much more brutal than it is in the game, and every small victory is hard-earned. The story isn't a fast-paced, action-filled adventure, it's a slow crawl from one station to the next with something going wrong at seemingly every turn. Artyom only kills one, arguably two people in the entire book. A Reich officer who shot a boy with Down syndrome that he was traveling with, and a guide from Polis who was attacked by a librarian after his gun jammed. I don't consider the second one Artyom killing him because he was already dying and he asked Artyom to finish the job. He isn't a one-man army like he is in the games. There are a lot of long, several-page conversations about philosophy, religion, politics, and just about everything else that you don't want to discuss on your first date if you're interested in a second one. Sometimes it does feel like people are talking just for the sheer sake of talking, but they almost always had something interesting to say, and these conversations are what help define Artyom's character by the end of the story. If that's not something that interests you, then it's likely you won't enjoy most of the story, but there's another aspect to the world of the Metro that I didn't expect to find. Horror. Of the psychological kind. Metro 2033 isn't a horror book, but there are several moments that manage to get under my skin. There aren't glowing orbs of electricity that will kill you if you touch them, and there aren't even ghosts that you can only see if you shine a flashlight on them. There's something even more sinister at play. The unknown. There is without a doubt something supernatural about the Metro, but the games oversimplify this threat to the point to where they lose their intrigue. In the book, the lines between supernatural and natural are very blurred. There are certain tunnels that you can't cross without at least 5 people, and if you try, you'll never be seen again. There are the tunnels that Artyom and Bourbon cross where something caused the man to suddenly die, like somebody typed kill into console commands, and then there are the things that are never explained at all. You're given multiple rational explanations for what happened, except none of them seem entirely correct. Artyom meets an old man after he gets separated with Khan, who, like I said, may or may not actually be insane, and they started discussing what happened to him in the tunnel to Riga. Khan told Artyom that the souls of the dead reside in the pipes because the nuclear bombs destroyed the afterlife, which is what we physically witnessed in the game. The old man scoffs at this explanation, and he tells Artyom that he once knew a scientist who told him that the mind could be negatively affected by low frequencies, around 7 Hz. He says it's much more likely that the pipes were echoing this frequency loud enough to cause everybody to essentially lose their mind. But there's an issue with this explanation too. Whenever Bourbon died, Artyom looked around but couldn't find any broken pipes. There are just enough contradicting explanations for these events that always come after they happen, so the effect isn't lost whenever you experience it. There was one part in the book that was probably the only time I've gotten chills while reading something that wasn't a creepypasta. Artyom passes through a station after escaping from some Jehovah's Witnesses, and yes, I mean escaping in the literal sense. They didn't hold him against his will, but he was trapped by moral obligation. The witness found him after he escaped from a Hansa hard labor camp shoveling shit in a septic tank and gave him a place to stay, but he ultimately rejected their teaching and left after the service. He comes to a station with 2 men and a cat where they have a conversation about religion. One of the men tells the story about the Invisible Watchers and how they're basically the gods of the Metro, to which I scoffed at because it's cleverly written to sound like a parody of Christian beliefs, and since Artyom was just exposed to that, of course Glukhovsky would be trying to make a statement about how foolish religion is. Except he's not. One of the men tells Artyom that he believes that everything will work out for the best as long as you follow the path of your destiny, which he immediately uses to rationalize all the crazy conveniences that have saved his life time and time again. He's so inspired that he finds the strength to sprint into a nearby tunnel leading to Polis, and eventually realizes he just marched headfirst into a pitch-black tunnel with no light. It's in this tunnel that things take a turn for the worst. Artyom starts hearing footsteps ahead of him, and they always stop whenever he does. He tries to tell himself that it's just the acoustics of the tunnel, but the steps are getting louder and louder with every step. He calls out to see if anybody is there, but he gets no response. As the sound gets louder, his resolve started to break, and he started swinging around trying to hit whatever was in front of him, but there was nothing there. Just as he concluded that he was losing his mind and that there was nothing there, somebody whispered in his ear, "Wait, you can't go there yet." This, of course, scares the shit out of him and sends him running in the opposite direction, where he finally has a breakdown and just sits on the rails of the metro tunnel for 20 minutes. It just so happens that some people attacked Polis right as he arrived, and the guards had fought them off. Had he not listened to the voice, then they would have mistaken him for an invader and killed him too. He He later learns from the Polis Council that the station where he talked to the two men from before was full of toxic gas, and he had been hallucinating the entire time, and yet it was that same voice that prevented his death. The Brahmins believe that the station gives visions to those who are chosen to help guide them to their destiny, but the military doesn't believe it. Was it really a hallucination, or was it something else? I'm not going to give a full summary of the entire book because that would take way too long, but I do think that it's worth reading yourself. There are a lot of notable differences between the book and the game, like how stalkers are only able to go to the surface after dark because the sun would blind them otherwise, which is what I think Miller was trying to say during the library mission when he says it's almost dawn, and a lot of characters are better expanded on. Bourbon is twice as shady as his video game counterpart, and it's hinted that he may have been planning to kill Artyom whenever they reach the station. And of course, we have the Dark Ones themselves. Artyom has fought against the Dark Ones before, and he describes it as the most terrifying moment in his life. Some people on watch duty at a nearby station captured a Dark One alive, and it died later in custody. They're said to take an absurd amount of ammo to kill, and their howl can make even the bravest man want to run from the battlefield. Their very presence is giving everybody at Exhibition nightmares, and even Hunter is shocked when he hears that Artyom's stepfather is afraid of them, because he isn't afraid of anything in the Metro. The presence of the Dark Ones is Artyom's fault, too. He and his friends wanted to go up to the surface so they could pretend to be stalkers, and when they were scared back into the Metro, the airlock door to the Botanical Gardens jammed, allowing the Dark Ones inside. Hunter learns all this after pressing Artyom for more information in a private conversation, and ends up entrusting him with the task of seeking out Miller if he doesn't return. It's not clear why he trusted Artyom, but I'm sure it's a combination of his relationship to his stepfather, and this being his fault in the first place. Hunter appears to Artyom in a dream telling him that he's dead, and Khan explains that the same thing happened to him. He asked him to help guide Artyom to Polis safely, which he was never able to do because they got separated when a group of people attacked a station they were at. Artyom has multiple dreams throughout his journey that have him walking into a tunnel by himself, and then backing out whenever he gets scared. During one of these dreams, he remembers that he has a lighter and finds a Dark One in front of him. This persists throughout the entire story until it finally culminates at the end, right before the missiles are launched at the Botanical Gardens. For whatever reason, Artyom is finally able to make contact with the Dark Ones, and he realizes that they've been trying to help humanity this whole time, but haven't been able to contact them. They chose Artyom as their medium because he was the one who opened the airlock to the Botanical Gardens, and for a brief moment he accepts their offer. Right as he does, the missiles launch and kill them all. Not a single Dark One survived. This encounter will haunt Artyom for the rest of the series and become part of a schism with the Order in Metro 2035. The obvious conclusion is that the Dark Ones were benevolent and misunderstood, and judging by the games, this is probably what Glukowski had intended, but I don't agree with that. There's too much evidence that suggests the Dark Ones are the threat that everybody thought they were. In both the games and the books, the Dark Ones have the ability to sense emotions. They know that the Metro's inhabitants are fighting back because they're scared, and yet they continue to bayonet charge the station and kill the defenders, including Artyom's best friend Xenia. They continue to instill a sense of hopelessness and fear in the people of Exhibition, despite knowing that this only makes them even more hated, and they're smart enough to know that there are better alternatives. There are even worse examples though, because Hunter isn't even dead. He's one of the main characters in Metro 2034, and his encounter with the Dark Ones was so traumatic that it literally turned him into Two-Face. He's left with a near uncontrollable urge to kill anybody who is even remotely hostile, and his psyche has been completely broken. He explains to Miller in that story that the Dark One showed him his true nature and basically brainwashed him into thinking that he was a merciless killer who was beyond redemption, and then left him there because they were convinced that he would commit suicide. He mutilated half his face in an attempt to control his homicidal urges, and it didn't work. This is even worse when you realize that Hunter never appeared to Artyom in a dream. It was the Dark Ones. He seems to think that they sent him on this journey so he could find the courage to establish contact with them, but I'm not sure if that's true. It's awfully convenient that they finally managed to have their breakthrough right as the missiles are being launched, and all these negatives are suddenly forgotten. I think the Dark Ones are manipulators and they needed to be destroyed, and if they truly wanted peace, they shouldn't have attacked the station time and time again, racking up the death toll and killing Artyom's best friend. Metro 2034 is my least favorite story in the series, and I don't have much to say about it. It has less grammatical errors than the previous book, but there are still enough to make it worth mentioning. You follow a new main character, Homer, or Nikolai as his real name is. He's an old man who likes telling stories and wants to immortalize himself by publishing his own story. He and Hunter are sent to find out why a caravan hasn't returned from the neighboring station, and Hunter claims that the station has been overtaken by bandits and that it needs to be burned to the ground. The truth is that the station is infected with a deadly plague, and Hunter knew that the station leadership wouldn't permit him to kill everybody, so he told them that their men were dead. They eventually crossed paths with 17-year-old Sasha, who was exiled with her father after the communists overthrew their station. She falls in love with Hunter, for reasons I never understood, and you get to awkwardly read this girl monologue about how she wants to try and seduce a man over twice her age. She's meant to be naive and innocent, but the entire dynamic made me a little uncomfortable. Eventually, Hunter tells Sasha that he feels nothing for her and leaves Homer behind after she runs off. You'll eventually meet Leonid, Moscovin's son, and he spends the rest of the story trying to get into Sasha's pants and leading her on about knowing a cure for the plague. Sasha wants to try and redeem Hunter while Homer begins to think the man is a bit of a psychopath. As it turns out, the plague can be cured if it's exposed to radiation, so they try to stop Hunter from massacring the entire station. A lot of details happen in between, like Hunter finding Miller, who's missing both his legs and an arm for reasons we'll get to later, and basically the entirety of Sasha and Leonid's journey together. The story is a little convoluted when summarized, but makes sense while reading it. Ultimately, the station is flooded after the quarantine is broken, and Hunter shuts the airlock door to prevent the water from reaching the neighboring stations. Sasha's body is never found, but she's presumed dead. Homer and Hunter return home, and that's basically the entire story. There are a few interesting details about Metro 2034. Artyom is in the story, but he has a very minimal presence. He's the one who was ordered to bomb the station after the quarantine broke and is responsible for the flood. The reason I didn't bring it up is because he was never actually there. Recall how I said that Homer was going to write a book about Hunter and Sasha. You get to read how his story begins, and it's the first paragraph of Metro 2034. In a roundabout way, Homer is the canonical author for that story, and a lot of details in the book are his own embellishments. This was really interesting to learn about while reading Metro 2035, and it's a creative way to retcon things like Artyom's presence in the story when he was never actually there. Sasha's entire character is much more innocent and romanticized than she actually is because Homer had such a high opinion of her, but by Metro 2035, she's working at a brothel and in a relationship with a man even older than Hunter. Artyom eventually learns that Hunter is alive, but he never actually goes to see him. I don't like Metro 2034 on its own merit, but I think it's a great setup for Metro 2035. It's a little less than 300 pages compared to the almost 500 pages of the other two stories, so it doesn't overstay its welcome. I do think that 4A were right not to try and make Metro Last Light about Homer and his journey with Hunter, because there are very few moments in that story that would translate well into a game. The same can be said about Metro 2035, and I think that Metro Exodus is much better than the book it's based on. Metro 2035 is the longest book in the series, and it would take way too long to properly go through the entire thing, so I'll only be mentioning the things I made a mental note of while reading. Please keep in mind that this bare-bones summary ignores huge portions of the story for the sake of being concise. This story shifts back to Artyom's perspective. He's now married to Anna, or Anya as she's called in the books, and they're living in an exhibition. If you've never played Metro Exodus, then I have a bombshell for you. Anya is Miller's daughter. To say that things are going poorly would be an understatement. Artyom is having trouble adjusting to his old life after serving in the Order, and he's found himself going to the surface more and more to search for survivors over the radio, but he is only met with static. He claims that he heard somebody from St. Petersburg whenever they launched the missiles at the Dark Ones, and everybody thinks he's gone insane. Anya is unhappy with how many trips he's making to the surface because he's taking in too much radiation, and he doesn't care. Homer arrives at the station because he wants to write a book about how Artyom stopped the Dark Ones, and eventually tells him that he knew a man who made contact with survivors. After having a fight with Anya, where she accuses Artyom's dick of having withered from the radiation, I'm not kidding, she actually says that, he leaves with Homer to go find the radio operator who had spoken to the survivors. They meet a man named Lyoka on the way, who becomes part of the squad, and after losing all his possessions after a drunken night at the brothel, Artyom's forced to pass through Reich territory because he no longer has his passport. Several chapters pass, and you learn that Artyom's entire trip to find this radio operator was a fruitless endeavor. The operator is killed, and eventually Artyom finds himself in Polis, so I guess we should talk about Miller. We all know and love Miller by this point in the video. We fought beside him to the bitter end, and he's proven to be reliable, if a bit closed-minded about the Metro's mysticism. If you've only ever played the games, you may be surprised to learn that Miller hates Artyom. After he learned about his contact with the Dark Ones, Miller concluded that Artyom is schizophrenic and can't be trusted. After fighting off the Reds at an unnamed bunker, which is D6 in Last Light, Miller loses both of his legs and one of his arms, confining him to a wheelchair. He becomes a bitter old man who outright tells Artyom that he thinks Anya is too good for him and that he doesn't deserve her. Anya, on the other hand, doesn't care what Miller says. I'll talk more about her in a moment. Over the course of the story, Artyom will meet Sasha in the brothel where he lost everything, and he'll fall in love with her. She appears to have some feelings for him, but you'll later learn that she only dates men old enough to be her father, or maybe a little older. Artyom had caught glimpses of Homer's journal containing the events of Metro 2034, and Sasha scoffs at the fact that she was depicted as an innocent young woman who could do no wrong. In reality, she's just as cynical as everybody else, and more than a little bit of a hoe. Artyom later meets Anya back in Polis, where she says that she wants him to come back with her to exhibition. He tells her that he doesn't love her anymore and that Miller wants him to leave her, and you'll learn that Miller doesn't really have a right to talk about being a piece of shit because her mother committed suicide just to get out of their marriage. This love triangle is a big part of the story, and it can be more than a little unsettling at times. I'm not sure why, but Glukhovsky added an entire chapter that is nothing but Artyom and Sasha having sex. It's not fanfiction levels of writing, it's rather lacking in details, but you could summarize the entire thing just by saying, Artyom stayed with Sasha for a week and they banged on the reg. Learning about Artyom's relationship with Anna and how their marriage started falling apart made me feel conflicted. On the one hand, it really does seem like they're not meant for each other with how she spoke to him in the beginning. She refused to listen to what he had to say and downright belittled him over and over, but at the same time, it's hard to justify how quickly Artyom just falls in love with the first woman to show him any affection, and if we're being realistic, Artyom doesn't love Sasha, he just thinks he does. Artyom is in a difficult position in this story. He's the only one who wants to leave the Metro, and he's desperate to find somebody on the surface who survived the war, being downright unwilling to accept that Moscow was the only place who managed to survive. At the end of the day, he sees himself as a bit of a martyr, putting his life on the line to find a real home for him and Anya, and later Sasha. His conflicted feelings throughout the story are human. They're as human as they could possibly be, and you could argue the same for Anya. In the beginning of the story, Anya resented their marriage, but once Artyom leaves, she realizes that she doesn't want to be without him. She tracks him down all the way to Polis and tries to bring him back home, and even when he says he doesn't love her anymore, she still doesn't give up. Artyom doesn't understand what she sees in him, considering he wasn't even the best soldier in the Order, but that's also the point. He wasn't a ruthless killing machine, he was more concerned with saving lives than taking them. There's really something to be said about the lengths she goes through just to bring him back, and it's Artyom's own lack of appreciation for her that causes this conflict. She gave up her position in the Order, her relationship with her father, and the surface altogether just to start a family with Artyom. She went from the best sniper in the Order to a mushroom farmer in exhibition, but just like how Artyom fails to realize what she gave up for his sake, she doesn't fully understand what he does for hers. She sees his obsession with leaving the Metro as a death sentence because of how much radiation he's sustaining. He went up to the surface so often that he can be outside during the daytime and be just fine, and everybody around him thinks he's insane, but he only wants to raise his children to grow up like human beings, breathing fresh air and not being dependent on vitamin D pills just to survive. And eventually, his tireless search will be rewarded. Artyom's search for survivors eventually leads him to a base that the Reds built on the surface. There's a wind farm with a pit full of dead bodies and several rows of pylons. Artyom and his crew kill everybody at the station and learn that this base is actually a jamming station that has been preventing anybody from making contact with the outside world. Miller radios the station and tells Artyom to stand down, and some rangers arrive to take him back to Polis, but not before one of Artyom's friends from the Order executes some survivors that they had met beforehand. When they make it back to Polis, they're told that the nuclear war never ended and that Russia is being occupied by US forces. The jammers are meant to make the world think that Moscow is dead so they don't launch another round of nukes on their head, and any survivors are said to be spies sent out to find if anybody survived the bombings. This is a unified effort by every government in the Metro. Anya tells Artyom that she's the one who convinced Miller not to just kill him, and eventually Artyom will learn that the leader of Hansa and the Reds are actually being controlled by one person, and it's Sasha's lover. Over the course of the story, Artyom will take a critical amount of radiation and start losing his hair. If you're a Fallout fan like me, then you're probably a little desensitized to radiation sickness. My first response was, why doesn't he just take some Radaway? And then I said, oh shit, that's right, this is realistic. He decides that he's going to wait in Sasha's room until the man arrives so he can interrogate him about what's really going on. He passes out from his radiation sickness and wakes up in a hospital where he's being treated. There is a form of Radaway in the Metro universe, but it was an experimental drug, so it's not easy to get a hold of. Artyom thinks he's dreaming, so he doesn't bother putting any clothes on, and he quickly learns that he's in a pre-war bunker that was converted into a museum after the Cold War. And he's naked. This is the headquarters for the Invisible Watchers, who basically act as the Metro's Illuminati. They control all the factions and even orchestrated several of the wars. Usually they try to keep things calm, but fighting for a cause keeps people from wanting to leave the Metro. As you can imagine, the US isn't actually occupying Russia. This was a convenient lie to keep the leaders under control. They also use blackmail, like how the leader of the Reich has a daughter with a genetic disorder, and yet he orders all other mutated children to be executed. The man who is telling all of this to Artyom says that Sasha gave up her spot in the bunker so that he could live, but he rejects everything and doubles down on exposing the Watchers to the entire Metro. He's blindfolded and escorted out of the bunker and then makes his way to Polis. His entire circle, including Homer, has been arrested by the Polis Guard and is being tried for desertion. Artyom devises a plan to expose the Watchers and reveal the truth to the Polis Council. One of his friends who served with him, Letyaga, is shot during the trial, resulting in a riot breaking out between the original members of the Order and those who were recruited from Hansa. This was a deal they made after the battle at the bunker to replenish their forces. Artyom surrenders to prevent them from killing Anya, and the rest of them carry out the plan. Lyoka kidnaps the man from Sasha's tent and brings him to the Polis Council to confess. This is when everything goes wrong. Lyoka sold out to the Invisible Watchers to secure himself a spot in the bunker, and Homer also sold out after they promised him a place to write his novels. These are especially frustrating because both of them survived a Reich hard labor camp with Artyom and had his back the entire story. The rest of the crew didn't know about the Watchers and were only in on the plan after the riot broke out. They spin a news story saying that the US is now run by tribals with nuclear technology and that they should remain in the Metro for their own safety. Miller steps down as commander of the Order and the status quo is maintained in the Metro. Only 2 people remain loyal to Artyom, Anya and a man from the Reich who had his newborn daughter executed, which caused his wife to commit suicide. The man decides to remain in exhibition after they escape from Polis. Artyom and Anya decide to leave the Metro after they failed to convince the people of exhibition to come with them, and because Hansa threatened to cut them off from the rest of the station if they don't hand Artyom over. At the end of the day, Anya was the only person who Artyom could rely on, and by the end of the story he realizes this. She was a ruthless bitch in this story, but she also proves to be more loyal than anybody else, and I think that's something every single man can appreciate. My biggest problem with this story, other than Artyom having an affair with a prostitute, was the Invisible Watchers themselves. It made me start to question all the supernatural encounters, and at least some of them are taken into consideration. The man who was showing Artyom the bunker chastised him for killing the Dark Ones, saying that he was saving them for an extinction-level scenario that would unify the entire Metro. These aren't very good people, and yet they're also researching a cure for a plague that is killing the mushrooms that the stations are growing and causing food shortages. Sure, they're morally gray, but you'd be hard-pressed to think that they're doing the right thing. I feel like the Watcher's entire existence undermines the supernatural side of the Metro and the things that are beyond its control, like the giant biomass growing in the Kremlin that has psychic powers and is responsible for drawing stalkers towards it. That's why they're not allowed to look at the stars, because there's really a giant mutated monster in there. Metro 2035 ends with Artyom and Anya driving into the sunset, and the Watchers decided to let them go, claiming there's nothing they could do anyways. I think it's a good story, but it lacks the atmosphere that Metro 2033 had, and it definitely wouldn't translate very well into a video game. Thankfully for everybody, Metro Exodus would go in a completely different direction. You've heard me mention several times by this point that Metro Exodus is my favorite game in the franchise, despite it being the most frustrating. I think that this game shows both the best and worst parts of the Metro formula, and that open-world survival isn't something that complements it. Metro Exodus as an open-world survival game doesn't compete with other games in that genre. If you compare this game to the likes of Far Cry, Dying Light, or other popular games of the genre, then you're likely going to be disappointed. But if you pick up this game expecting it to be like its predecessors in an open world, then you'll have a much better time with it. The issue is, the open world really is this game's biggest weakness, and I feel like it would be better off without it. This game is at its best in tightly designed linear areas, and there are plenty of those throughout its runtime. The biggest problem with the open world is that it's too empty. There are multiple upgrades you can acquire by exploring, but beyond that, there's really nothing to fill the void. There are a couple of enemy bases you can attack, but I've never found that appealing on hardcore since enemies now take more shots to kill than I did, and I didn't find any useful loot at the ones that I did. The upgrades you do find are very useful. They range from extra ammo pouches for your armor, night vision goggles, extended filter life for your gas mask, armored helmets, to my personal favorite, a heartbeat sensor attached to your bracer. There are other useful tools like a metal detector for people who struggle to find loot, extended batteries for your flashlight in NVGs, or a brighter flashlight that burns through its batteries quicker. Every upgrade is useful, and only being able to equip one per slot makes each one you can't use feel like a real loss. You can switch these out at any workbench, and the NVGs count as part of your equipment, so they don't count as a slot. None of these upgrades are worth an entire open world, and I think it would have been even better if they had focused more on larger linear areas like they did the Taiga instead of a true open world, because the open worlds felt like a chore to get through. Thematically, being stuck in these regions makes a lot of sense, but they're not very interesting from a gameplay perspective. The most obvious problem is that you have limited sprint in this game. This normally isn't a problem, but it slows exploration down to a crawl, and this is really something that should have been fixed during playtesting. You are given other ways of exploration, like a boat in the first region and a car in the second, but there are still moments where you'll be covering large stretches of the map on foot, and having infinite sprint would make these sections much more enjoyable. I think it's worth acknowledging that there is a large percentage of players who like the open world in this game, and there's a chance you're one of them. The people I've talked to, mostly in YouTube comment sections, make some strong points. There isn't a checklist system of things to do like in most open world games such as Far Cry, Dragon Age Inquisition, The Witcher 3, etc. You're given a couple of side quests that nudge you towards exploring, but most of it is up to you, and there are things you can easily miss, like this hermit I found in the desert living out of a spider-infested wrecked ship. If you don't use a guide to locate the upgrades, then you'll notice that they're not always easy to find, and it encourages you to scrounge every building for everything it's worth. There are day and night cycles, as well as weather unique to each area. The thunderstorms of the Volga, the sandstorms of the desert that require you to put on your gas mask just to breathe, and the foggy days of the Taiga. You can find safe houses around the map that offer a workbench and a place to sleep, and not everything there is to find in the world is marked on your map. The quest markers are inoffensive, and your discoveries truly are your own. It is a different kind of open world experience, and to the right person, this is exactly how open world should be. And despite my criticism, I have to agree with that sentiment. The open world is undeniably flawed, but it also offers complete player freedom with how you explore it, although you can be punished for ignoring it entirely, which I see as a misstep. There's an even bigger issue than the open world in this game, and it's something that fractures that careful balance I mentioned in the beginning of this video. The game's resource management is straight dog water. You can no longer buy things at a vendor anymore. Everything must be crafted at a workbench, so your currency has shifted from cartridges to resources. You can still loot ammo off enemy bodies, but what you get is negligible and makes it seem like everybody you killed was on their last shot. You can craft ammo at a workbench, and the number of resources it takes can easily bankrupt you. This is a problem because the game doesn't supply you with enough ammo to handle the amount of mandatory combat encounters it thrusts you into without warning. I'll loop back around to this point in a moment. It seems that the game expects you to be constantly running out of ammo, because your third weapon slot is reserved for a pneumatic rifle that uses steel balls, which can be crafted from your inventory out in the field. I hated being forced to use this rifle because I was almost always stocked on revolver ammo and would have much preferred to carry that around with me instead. After a while, I got used to relying on the pneumatic rifle for stealth, since full autoing with a suppressed weapon can cause it to jam. Still, I would have preferred to be allowed to carry whatever I wanted like I could in the first two games. Despite this mandatory handicap, I still found myself constantly low on ammo, and whatever resources I didn't spend restocking were spent on filters and medkits, because I almost never found any that could be looted on hardcore, and they're not cheap. You also need to clean your weapons so they don't jam while firing, and you need to fix your gas mask whenever it breaks. Unlike the previous games, you can't replace your gas mask with a new one, so even if you're in a story section where you can't leave and your mask breaks, you can't replace it with a perfectly good mask that you can find laying around. This only happened to me on my first playthrough, so it's likely that I just didn't prepare well enough, but it was still frustrating whenever it happened. Resources are scarce on hardcore mode, but the game always gives you about 200 of everything at certain points in the story so you can restock. Most of this went towards making more medkits. Since you take so much damage in this game, you're less likely to run into bandits if you travel at night, but mutants are more plentiful and vice versa. Again, this was mostly an issue on my first playthrough whenever I didn't know what to expect, but it was still an issue. Most damage is unavoidable, but enemies will usually try to flank you, so even when I was in a good position, I would get one-shotted by a shotgun from behind and was forced to reload a save. The shotguns in this game have an absurd amount of range too, because 4A actually opted for realistic gunplay instead of the Call of Duty tactic of just having your shots disappear after a certain distance. So the resource management is less than great in this game because you'll constantly be crafting filters, medkits, and ammo. This would normally encourage exploration, but I was more eager to get through the story than run around looking for glowing mushrooms and scrap. The upgrades are the most exciting things to find, but they alone aren't interesting enough to justify such an open world. You can also strip weapon mods off weapons you find, but you'll likely find them just fine when looting enemy bodies. The only real unique weapon mod you can find is the night vision scope, and I never had an issue getting a hold of one. If the maps were a little bit smaller or the exploration was faster, then much of this wouldn't be an issue. I think the first and third regions are the best designed, and the second one is the biggest slog of the entire game, although a lot of people still like that region too. The combat and stealth feel the same as the previous games, but there are many noticeable changes. For starters, the AI is a lot smarter now. In fact, they're so smart that they can spot you while executing an enemy even if there is nobody around. This is a bug I ran into quite a few times, and while it wasn't game-breaking, it was still annoying. There was also the issue of the execution prompt not appearing before you got spotted. In the previous games, you could easily knock somebody out before they had a chance to call you out, but this only worked half the time for me. I would be right behind or in front of an enemy and there would be no prompt to knock them out, so I'd get spotted. This is especially frustrating when you're doing a no-kill run to get the good ending, since you can't just shoot them in the face when the prompt fails to load. If there was a passive alternative for your stealth weapons, like rubber bullets or sleep darts, then this wouldn't be a problem. I noticed on my second playthrough, because in the first one I got the bad ending, that you were seriously neutered while trying not to kill everybody. You can throw a can to distract enemies as a silent alternative to throwing knives, but your pneumatic rifle is borderline useless except for one section where you can stealth through a building full of the dreaded humanimal mutants that I'll get into in a moment. I don't think there are enough pacifist options for stealth, so you'll be running into this bugged prompt a lot if you want the good ending. Despite this, I think that Exodus has some of the best stealth sections in the entire franchise, and it shows just how great 4A has gotten at making these levels. Where the game suffers is whenever they try to do anything else. The forced combat sections are incredibly frustrating because the devs didn't properly balance the combat. Headshots are almost always a one-shot kill, but they gave enemies the ability to dodge bullets if they see you aiming at them, which can result in you getting killed in 1 or 2 shots. This only happened twice on my second playthrough, but it was the dumbest thing I'd ever seen in my life. There is a very reasonable and realistic explanation for this if it was kept consistent. If an enemy saw your laser sight placed on their head, then yes, it's reasonable to think they'd be able to dodge the shot. Not the second you pull the trigger, because that would require inhuman reflexes, but they'd at least be on their guard. The problem is that while in stealth, enemies don't react to your laser sight at all, and for good reason. If they could spot your laser sight, then lining up headshots would be frustrating and make the stealth even worse. But it would also be more realistic. It's very possible that this is what's going on, but only making the enemy aware of your laser in combat is inconsistent and is likely to confuse the player, just like it did me. Another problem is whenever enemies can take more than 5 shots to kill. By this point in the story, the enemies are wearing makeshift metal-plated armor, but I still think 5 shots is a bit excessive. There's an even worse example though, and it's the Juggernauts. There are only roughly 4 of these in the game, one of which is sleeping and can be stealth killed if you want to avoid the fight. The best way to deal with them is to use Molotovs or incendiary rounds, but good luck trying to kill it regularly. They're just as tough as the one you fight in Last Light, except their gun can one-shot you if you're not careful. I even had somebody flank me with a shotgun and kill me instantly one time, which was so much fun that I considered navigating to the uninstall button and playing the hard drive cleanup game. I only beat the Juggernaut boss fight on my first playthrough because the doors he comes through bugged out and it locked him outside, so I could safely shoot him without taking damage. My second playthrough was much smoother because I realized there's a stockpile of rifle ammo on the table nearby. I already ranted about the Juggernaut from Last Light, so I don't feel the need to repeat myself here. This fight is poorly balanced and it's only enjoyable if you know exactly what you're supposed to do, and since on my first playthrough I didn't see this fight coming, I didn't stock up on Molotovs. On my second playthrough I did, and it was basically a joke. Despite these grievances, I think Exodus has some of the best gunplay in the entire franchise. For starters, I was on PC, so I could actually turn up my damn sensitivity to a reasonable amount, and the entire game feels more like Battlefield 4 than Metro 2033 or Last Light. Laser sights actually determine where your shot is going to land instead of simply reducing the spread of your hip fires, and I had a blast with the game's combat whenever I wasn't dying to a shotgun from a football field away. I'm heavily biased towards Battlefield-style gameplay, considering that Battlefield 3 is my favorite game of all time, so Metro Exodus was just as much fun as it was frustrating. I was so used to the laser sight actually being where your shot lands that I was getting shit on when I went back to Cold War with the boys. By the way, here's my official Cold War review. It sucks ass, don't buy it. All in all, Exodus has really solid shooting mechanics, but unlike the previous games, I don't think hardcore mode was very well balanced. For the first time in any of these games, I felt like I was at a disadvantage against the AI. The last thing we need to talk about before getting into the story are the conversations. Voice lines weren't properly synced, so oftentimes somebody will start talking before the other one has finished, and it makes conversations feel jarring and unnatural.
Why are they hiding the fact that Moscow didn't survive alone? There, in the ravine, there are people from other cities.
This is an issue that happens throughout the game, and it can make it hard to follow what's going on when several people are involved in the same conversation. Another issue I have is that Artyom is still a silent protagonist. This was something that suited the previous games perfectly, but I don't think it works so well in Exodus. There are several optional conversations in this game that feel downright awkward without Artyom responding, especially during conversations with Anna. Whenever Artyom is receiving orders or listening to somebody explain something about what's going on, it's okay if he doesn't respond, but whenever somebody's asking him a question mid-conversation, it feels weird to just stare at him and say nothing at all, unless you're trying to roleplay as an introvert or an edgelord. The worst example is in the third region, where you need to recover your backpack from some tribals. Artyom just approaches the bags with his hands up and points in it like, "Me take a backpack now." Even the white kid in the back of the class who wears hoodies in the summertime isn't this quiet. I was that kid, by the way. And I think the conversations could greatly benefit from having Artyom speak outside of loading screens. So, all that leaves us with is the story, and since I have an endless number of things to say on this franchise, I might as well give this portion an introduction too. The story of Metro Exodus is great because of how it differs from Metro 2035. All of the main details are there, the jammer, the wind farm, invisible watchers, and Miller's deception, but the writers took the story in a completely different direction, and this is the best decision that they could have made. By this point in time, we have already had 2 games in the Moscow Metro, and it had completely lost its charm. The ghosts aren't intimidating anymore. I was sick to death of Nosolysis long before the end of the last game, and demons have become nothing more than an inconvenience. Had Exodus been another game inside the Metro, then I would have probably been more sick of the place than Artyom was. The team made a great decision. They were going to consolidate the most interesting part of Metro 2035, the jammers and the invisible watchers, and put it in the first hour of the game. Everything afterwards would be wholly original with only slight elements of the book it's inspired by. I use the term original very loosely because not all of the factions you meet throughout the story are interesting, but the story more than makes up for these shortcomings. It's also important to note that Glukovsky was not the lead writer for this game. That title goes to Andrei Paskalov. Yeah. And I personally think he did a great job. I remember focusing a lot on the characters of Exodus while playing, and I spent a long time trying to figure out why I liked them so much, or rather why I hated the cast in The Last of Us 2. There were several times while playing Exodus when I would stop and think of The Last of Us 2, and it's not in the, wow, I really hate that game, this is so much better kind of way, but more of the, holy shit, why does this remind me of The Last of Us 2 so much way. There were several parallels that caught my attention, and it all started with the first faction you meet, a cult of psychotic pseudo-Christians who think the use of technology is a sin. I'm not accusing Naughty Dog of plagiarizing Metro Exodus. The gameplay trailer featuring the scars released at E3 of 2018, and Metro Exodus came out in 2019. My conclusion was that neither of these factions are entirely original. Once the connection between these games was established, I found it harder and harder to sever it. Whenever I would enter an alert before I was actually spotted, I would say that happened to me a lot in The Last of Us 2, but after attempting to play through the game again for a video that I'm never going to make because I can't bring myself to keep playing, I realized that the quirks with The Last of Us 2's AI are a result of its complexity, whereas Exodus still has simple AI and this weird bug. You're probably wondering where I'm going by this point, so just bear with with me for a second. I realized about 1/3 into the story that my criticism about the characters of The Last of Us 2 wasn't entirely accurate, and that's because I didn't actually realize why I disliked them so much. For those of you who haven't watched that video, and I don't blame you because the mic quality is dog ass, I criticize characters like Dina and Jesse for being too shallow, while praising characters like Owen and Lev for feeling like actual people. On the surface, this criticism is still true. I dislike Dina for multiple reasons, but the biggest is because she feels like a cardboard cutout who only exists to be Ellie's girlfriend, but I realized while playing Metro Exodus and then replaying the first half of The Last of Us 2 that there is an even deeper problem that I didn't notice. That problem was the dynamic between the characters. The cast of Metro Exodus is no deeper or more interesting than that of The Last of Us 2. Sam is a Spartan Ranger and a former US soldier voiced by Steve Blum, and that is his entire character. Tokarev only really talks whenever he has an upgrade for your pneumatic rifle, Idiot is named Idiot for reasons I could never work out, Crest is just Pavel as an engineer instead of a communist, and the list goes on for shallow and generally uninteresting characters. Except they're not uninteresting. After clearing a region, you get a free roam section that lasts until you interact with the map and move to the next area, and during this section you get to speak with the characters or listen in on their conversations, and these people actually talk to each other like they're family. I couldn't tell you much about Stepan and Katya, but it's very clear that he cares for her, and whenever you attend their wedding halfway through the game, it doesn't feel like it's out of nowhere. Your actions will determine the fate of your crew, and their mood is affected by these decisions. If you kill the cultist in the first region, then the youngest member of your crew, Duke, will die. While on the train, you'll find the surviving members drinking to his memory and mourning his loss. Tokarev will make a comment saying how Duke kept joking about his armor not holding the back plate anymore, and then quickly changes the subject. You can tell in this brief interaction that he blames himself for his death because he never took the time to fix his armor. If Duke survives, Tokarev still mentions how he jokes about his armor, but it's a much more lighthearted tone. All the guys are having a drink as Duke tells a story about his perspective on the mission. These people aren't very deep, but there's a real dynamic between them that I think was lacking in The Last of Us 2. While I was doing that playthrough, I noticed how the voice lines were delivered in a very dreary and monotone way, which I'm sure is how they were asked to deliver it. I never felt any chemistry between the characters, which made it hard for me to care about them. This was something that I never felt in the scenes with Ellie and Joel, but I think that has more to do with the history from the first game that was already established. I still think that these characters lack some depth, but I think the real issue is that they talk to each other like a bunch of strangers when they're supposed to be a group of close friends. If I were to reevaluate The Last of Us 2 in another video, something I started but have since decided isn't worth the brain cells it costs to slog through the game for a third time, I would say that having a good dynamic between your cast of characters is much more important than giving your characters some in-depth backstory. Realistically, you should find a balance between both like Exodus does, but listening to the monotone dialogue makes me care a lot less about what's being said. This is a topic that I was surprised to end up putting so much emphasis on, but it was also what sold these characters for me and made these conversations feel more believable, at least whenever Artyom wasn't refusing to speak. I think it's about time we get into the game's story. As always, it starts off with a cutscene. Artyom monologues about how he remembers life on the surface and how humanity wasn't meant to live underground. He talks about how the nuclear war wasn't enough to kill our bad habits, such as war and corruption. He won't accept that he's meant to die underground, so he's committed himself to finding out if there were other survivors. You then get a beautiful shot of the destroyed, snow-covered streets of Moscow, and right off the bat, you can see how great this game looks. This game reminds me a lot of Battlefield 4 in terms of visuals, which is good because even today that game looks fantastic. I ran this game on a mid to lower end PC with a GTX 1650 and was able to achieve mostly stable frame rates on high graphics. I don't critique the graphics of a game, but the contrast between Exodus and Last Light is jarring, and I think being able to damn near replicate the visuals of the Frostbite engine is a feat worthy of praise. Artyom is returning from one of his many trips to the surface when he's attacked by a pack of watchmen. This leaves him on death's door right outside Exhibition, where he's saved by a group of rangers that were sent by Miller to find him. This is the same group you'll be traveling with throughout the game, and this serves as your introduction. They carry you on a stretcher to the medics, and you get to listen as the locals ridicule Artyom for his constant trips to the surface, insinuating that he's losing his mind, just like in the book. They get you to the hospital and give you a blood transfusion, and you wake up to find Anna sitting next to you. She chastises Artyom for his constant trips to the surface and tells him that there aren't any survivors, and if there were, then they would have made it to the metro by now. Miller then arrives and proceeds to chew him out for his lack of regard for Anna and how he left the Order when they needed him the most, after the battle for D6. He demands that Artyom return to Polis to rejoin the Order and then pulls Anna aside to speak with her. The doctor then tells Artyom that his blood is becoming more and more irradiated with each trip to the surface and that he can't guarantee he'll be able to save him next time. Just from this scene alone, you'll probably notice that Miller in Exodus is much different than how he was in the book, and this alone is enough to make me like this game even more. If you wait a moment before opening this door, you can hear Anna and Miller's conversation. He wants both of you to return to Polis and criticizes your life in Exhibition. Once you step outside, everybody decides to celebrate you're not dying. You then get a time jump to 1 week later, and Artyom is once again on the surface with his radio, looking for survivors. Anna insisted on coming with him this time, and she once again ridicules him for wasting his time. As you make your way back, she tells you that she's warmed up to Miller's offer about going back to Polis, and she wants Artyom to accept it. You also learn that you're in a restricted area controlled by Hansa, and you see a train go by as you travel through it. A car arrives, and Anna says that they're members of the Order, and once you enter it, you're knocked unconscious. When you come to, Anna says that the people who picked you up were actually Hansa guards, and you've been detained, alongside an old woman and a young boy. Anna learns from them that there really are survivors, and claims that they need to tell the whole metro about it when they can. The car stops shortly after, and the guards prepare to execute the detainees. Artyom tries to intervene, but he isn't able to stop the guards and is shot alongside the other two as Anna watched. She was either unable or unwilling to get involved in time. You're dropped at the bottom of a pit full of dead bodies where you can pick up a gas mask and a single medkit, then try to find your way out. This is the wind farm from the book, as can be seen by the turbines nearby, so you should have a pretty good idea of where this is going. You climb through a large pipe and see that this is also a train station. Then here is somebody named Yermak fights with the guards about the executions. They throw him in a room that the pipe led to, and he realizes that you're the person Anna has been fighting with the guards about. He agrees to help you for reasons that aren't clear at this time. This serves as your stealth tutorial, showing you how to disable lights and use the darkness for cover, as well as how to use decoys to distract the guards. This is a feature that I never found necessary since AI pathing is usually pretty simple, but it's nice to have the option at the very least. You make it to the room they're holding Anna in and get to work whooping the base commander's ass. You learn that Artyom was wearing the tags that Hunter gave him from the first game and it stopped the bullet. I'm not entirely sure if this is possible, but it's a neat detail, so I don't mind the contrivance. It's not like we haven't had plenty of those by this point anyways. The commander wakes up from his brief nap and goes for your gun, and the control panel is damaged in the process. This shuts off the jammers and allows radio traffic from other cities to come through. Anna interrogates the commander for a brief second, and he says that the nuclear war never ended. She gets to see firsthand that Artyom was right and the entire world survived the fallout. Then the commander calls an alert saying there's been an enemy attack. Anna puts him back to sleep, and you get to work escaping. Yermak arrives and gives you the stuff Hansa confiscated, and then tells you to get to the train hangar so you can get out of here. You sneak past or kill the Hansa guards blocking your path, and the jammer kicks back in the process. Yermak was detained for acting suspicious, and the guards are called back to handle a watchman attack somewhere else, so you're met with minimal resistance whenever you eventually get into a fight. He tells you to align the tracks so you can get the train moving, and then you steal it from Hansa. Once it gets moving, you're hit with a flashbang and are detained by Hansa again. The officer orders you and Anna to be executed, but your captors refuse. Miller arrives, and you learn that the people holding you are actually the squad from the beginning of the game, so they quickly turn on the Hansa guards that were with them. Miller starts chewing you both out for what happened and says that Hansa won't take this lying down. Anna starts arguing with him and tells everybody that there are other survivors. Miller says that he'll explain everything later and tells Yermak to find a safe place to take the train so you can lie low for a while. He tells the rest of the squad to hang back, and they refuse to leave you. They throw the Hansa guards overboard and get the train moving, and Anna pulls you aside to get some air. She starts ranting about the revelation when another train shows up and starts firing on yours. Another Hansa officer comes on a loudspeaker and says that those were warning shots and orders you to stop the train. Miller tells him that the brakes are damaged to buy some time and orders you to go put some explosives on the other train's firebox since you're the one who got them into this mess. You're given some plastic explosives and jump aboard the train while Miller distracts them. I love this section because of its design. It's not your first example of hidden pathways, but it's the best way to show that there are usually going to be multiple routes through an area. You can go in guns blazing and kill everybody, but there are some obviously placed alternatives to sneak your way through. Right as the Hansa officer realizes that they're stalling for time, Yermak hits the brakes and falls far behind them. You put the C4 on the firebox and pull the emergency brake so your train can catch up, and then jump back across, ready to blow the train.
You don't want to hear about that, Vault Hunter. You want to hear about loot, pets, and explosions. I'm Tor, and I'm here to ask you one question, and one question only. Explosions?
Miller tells you that you're now considered traitors and enemy saboteurs, so you won't be returning to Moscow. The game takes place over several different seasons in various locations. It's wintertime now, and you're on your train trying to figure out what to do next. Your Geiger counters are in the green, so the outside world is actually more habitable than Moscow. Miller explains that the war never ended and that the jammers were designed to prevent more strikes against Russia, the same explanation we saw in the book. The difference is that Miller is aware of the Watcher's presence and believes that Russia is being occupied by the enemy. He only learned about this 6 months ago, which explains the difference in attitude from when he first found D6 to now. He tells you to find a radio signal for a bunker that holds the remnants of the Russian government in hopes of finding them and receiving a pardon. You find the signal, and you find the location from the transmission. Everybody agrees to name the train Aurora and decides to celebrate their newfound purpose. Miller pulls you aside to talk to you about everything in private. He indirectly apologizes for not sharing things sooner, saying that he tried to talk you out of going up to the surface but didn't have the clearance to tell the truth. He says the revelation shocked him after the events of D6, making him question what you were even fighting for in the first place, but he understood the need for secrecy. He then chastises you for what happened with the jammer, saying that you put the entire metro in jeopardy and could have gotten everybody killed. He says not to do stupid shit like that ever again, but at least now there's a clear goal in sight. There are several other optional conversations you can listen to before proceeding. These can last upwards of 5 or more minutes, and while they're a good way to flesh out these characters, I don't feel the need to mention every single one. I also haven't listened to all of them, so you won't be missing much if you decide to just focus on getting through the story. Your first area is the Volga, so welcome to this game's swamp level. It's not near as bad as the one in Last Light, and I think it's the best non-linear open-world region in the game, mostly because it's relatively small and easy to travel through. You and Anna have a short conversation before accidentally ramming through a blockade that was set up by the locals. They fire at the train before it hits a barricade, stopping it in its tracks. Yermak says that the shots pierced a cylinder, so you're stuck here until you can repair it. Miller thinks that the people you ran into are part of the forces occupying the country, so he tells everybody to be alert. He sends you and Anna to check out a nearby church to find out what's going on, and Tokarev gives you your backpack, which works as a portable crafting station for basic supplies. You take a boat to the church while Anna hangs back to cover you from a distance, and you're welcomed inside by somebody who politely asks you to keep your weapon holstered, claiming that the people here are peaceful. As you enter, a girl from somewhere in the church shouts that they're all liars and they killed her friends and her father. Gates close around your boat and the priest shouts the heretic is trapped. You make it to the top and find the girl's mother, Katya. The girl's name is Nastya. She says that Silantius, the priest in charge, locked her in here a year ago and they've sent armed guards to your location. You may have noticed that I didn't bring up this game's morality system during my general analysis, and that's because I wanted to save it for this part. Let's rewind real quick and go over that now. In all 3 of these games, the morality system is boiled down like this. Killing is bad, so don't do it.
He is very bad, but you are right. Killing is worse.
I think that this is an unrealistically simple stance on the subject that doesn't leave much room for grayness. The way I see it, it doesn't really matter if I executed everybody I came across because they would have killed me if they spotted me. You're given an option to knock them unconscious, but everybody you refuse to kill will only turn around and kill even more people, so why not eliminate that threat? The reason I'm bringing this up now is because what you do in this church will determine if Duke lives or dies, and I don't think that's fair. Let's go over what happened again. The guy at the front of the church said that the people here are peaceful, but they're obviously religiously indoctrinated. The little girl, who has been trapped here against her will with her mother, says that these people killed her father. Silantius immediately traps you and sends armed guards to your location who will shoot you on sight, and you can confirm from Katya yourself that what her daughter said was true. Here's the first thing I thought of when I got to this area. These people lured me into a trap and are going to kill me. I don't know if Silantius has been forcing himself on Katya this whole time, but I do know that he's using religious manipulation to keep these people controlled, so it's likely that he has been. Why else would he keep them locked up for a full year? There's no messing around with these people, kill them all and get out of here. If you reacted in this way, then congratulations, you've just killed Duke. I think this is a shitty way of punishing the player for decision making that you probably don't even know is happening right now. Your very first interaction with these people is hostile, so why are you going to punish the player for automatically assuming that this insane cult isn't full of lunatics that want you dead, when every other post-apocalyptic setting has conditioned you to think otherwise? There is a bit of nuance in the morality of this game, but this one is black and white, which I hate. You're punished for not automatically assuming that the knockout button is the path to the good ending, but you're also given little reason to think these people are worth sparing. Except there is a good reason to. After your first set of guards, which by the way, if you kill even one of without them opening fire first, you've killed Duke, you can find a door where the rest of the congregation is hiding. They tell you that what Nastya said isn't true, and they didn't kill anybody. Her father was killed by demons and she blames them for his death. The man inside says that they have many orphans like her here and moves you out of the room, then locks the door. They don't scream for the guards, they don't all charge you in some suicidal attempt to get your weapons, they just ask you to leave. My problem with this section is that it isn't handled very well. The setup should work like this. Your arrival at the church is the same, except when Katya tells you how to escape, she asks you not to kill any of the guards, saying that they think you're trying to kill the congregation and only want to protect them. This interaction with the rest of the church folk is mandatory to progress, so you can see that not everybody here is automatically hostile. Then funnel you past the guards to the boat and away from the church. You're still given the option to kill them, but now you have a real incentive not to. On my first playthrough, I assassinated every guard I came across and was eventually spotted because I didn't know where to go. I won the firefight, and a couple of guards surrendered after I took out a majority of their forces, which is something the AI does in this game that I really like. I knocked out those who surrendered and killed a member of the congregation who said that his entire family was already dead and he was tired of living. In hindsight, I didn't really think of the consequences of this decision or the fact that nobody would know that he asked me to kill him, so that one is on me. Later on, I had several friendly conversations with the zealots and met a man who didn't believe in the faith but didn't want to abandon his son who did. It was from this man in the corner of the map that I learned that these people are peaceful, they're just extremely xenophobic. Regardless, I still felt justified in most of my decisions. Most of them. I rescued some of the cultists who were being held prisoner by some bandits and did everything I could to help them, but it didn't matter. I'd already killed a handful of people in the very first area, so Duke died regardless. It's okay for a game to have unforeseen consequences to your actions, but I don't think it's fair if the consequence is so punishing this early on. For example, this done well, let's look at The Witcher 3. The prologue ends in a fight at a tavern. You and Vesemir did everything in your power to avoid a confrontation, but the locals insisted on pushing you. This fight is 100% in self-defense, but it's also unavoidable. You're forced to see the consequence of your actions when the people you were actually trying to help turn against you. You leave this place worse off than when you arrived. In the very next area, you're met with a similar situation. You're alone this time, so you have a choice. Continue to escalate the situation, which ends in another bloodbath, or try to talk them down from their aggressions. If you choose to kill these guards, then you'll be denied entry to the Baron's fort whenever the quest leads you there. You have to find another way inside by climbing through a well, and he remarks on how you slaughtered his men, but the quest proceeds as usual. You were shown that your actions have consequences in a way that isn't overly punishing, and you'll consider your choices harder in the future. Your first choice in Metro Exodus is poorly set up and overly punishing, and the game relies too heavily on the logic that you're being given an option not to kill these people, so you should just automatically take it. In a backwards sort of way, the next two areas do a much better job at showing you who you can and can't kill. The morality in this game is simplified in other ways too. In the desert section, you'll travel through a cave where somebody had set up incendiary traps. You'll find these slavers burning and dying, but you'll receive negative karma if you kill them here. Keep in mind that you are meant to be killing these guys, and you're encouraged to take out as many of them as possible throughout the course of the story, but the moment I decide to mercy kill this man who is slowly dying and blind, the game goes, "Damn, you're one cold-hearted son of a bitch, ain't ya? You must really want that bad ending." This is the most egregious example of how the game oversimplifies morality as a whole. Why is it okay to kill a perfectly fine, healthy, living slaver, but you're expected not to put one of them out of their misery? This is something that makes absolutely no sense to me. Remember that in the Metro 2033 book, Artyom shoots his friend who has a librarian's hand inside his stomach after he begs him to do it. The games would just expect you to leave him alone to slowly bleed out or get eaten. Getting back on topic, you make your way to the docks and lower the boat. If you get out quietly, then Anna will remark on it, but if you caused an alert, she'll say the cultists are likely to hate you even more now. Regardless, she gets Katya and Nastya out of the tower and takes them back to the Aurora. Another round of shrimps try to kiss you, but Artyom refuses to accept them for who they are and beats it with his oars, then proceeds to shoot the rest. This upsets their fat best friend, who shows up to try and tell you that men ain't shit and you're knocked out of the boat. Duke helps pull you out of the water and starts complaining that Miller won't send him on any real missions. As the youngest of the crew, he's desperate to prove himself and see some action, and he's jealous that you always get to have all the fun. He then points you in the direction of a nearby plane that has some potential loot, and inside you can find the compass for your bracer. This is a very good way of nudging the player towards exploring and showing you that there are gear upgrades out in the world. Once you're back at the train, Miller is asking Katya everything she knows about the area, and then he pulls you aside to tell you about a mechanic named Crest who lives nearby. He wants you to go and recruit him so he can help Yermak fix the train. Tokarev gives you your pneumatic rifle and you're sent on your way. Whenever you make it to Crest's hideout, you'll encounter the worst enemy in the game, the Humanimals. It's very obvious that these are meant to be pseudo-zombies, likely inspired by feral ghouls from Fallout. They can take up to 7+ shots to the chest to kill, but only 1 or 2 to the head, so you're incentivized to go for headshots. This enemy sucks, because landing headshots isn't as easy as it sounds, so you'll be burning through all your shotgun ammo trying to kill them. I also hate how they're the second most common enemy in the entire game. I fought so many of these things in the desert that it started to feel more like a zombie apocalypse than a nuclear one, and they're not an interesting enemy to fight. All the games have an issue with enemy variety, but stuffing every corner with these not feral ghouls that chew through my already limited ammo was more frustrating than fun. I think that the game had a real chance to use these regions to show how the local wildlife had evolved, like the catfish here in the Volga. You clear out the zombies, and Crest lowers the crane for you. He's voiced by the same person as Pavel from Last Light, so I can just pretend that he gave up on communism, changed his name, and left the metro after I saved his life. He points you to more nearby locations that are worth seeing, and you get the binoculars from him. As you make your way down, Miller radios in asking where Anna is at, and Stepan says she went to check out a nearby antenna that she thought she saw something at. Once you make your way there, you collapse through the floor and find her unconscious. The air in this room is toxic, and she didn't have her gas mask on. You put it on for her and then make your way to the hatch that will open the large door. Once you do, Demir and Sam arrive. Anna radios in saying that her batteries died when she dropped her radio in the water and that she's fine, then returns to the Aurora. While you were gone, Stepan was trying to convince Miller to let Katya and Nastya stay with them, and he refused. Katya is a medic, so it would make sense for her to come along with you, but there isn't enough space on the Aurora for everybody. Stepan refuses to let them go back to the cultist, and Anna asks you to help convince Miller to let them stay. Before you get a chance to do that, Miller briefs you on your mission. You need to get the Aurora across the bridge that the cultist uses their fortress, but he doesn't want to outright assault it either. Crest knows about some trade caravans that come to trade with them, so your job is to hijack the boat and disguise yourself as the traders, then infiltrate the fortress and lower the bridge. I hope you were paying attention to that while playing, because I had completely forgotten this detail by the time I was done exploring and had no idea what was going on. It was also like 2 in the morning, so that might have something to do with it. Stepan shows up and once again starts arguing with Miller about letting Katya and Nastya come with them. She told them about a train carriage that they could use for extra space, and Anna argues that everybody is already tired of sleeping in shifts, so you might as well get it while you're waiting for the traders to arrive. Crest says that he has a rail car hidden in a train terminal nearby that you can use to tow the carriage back to the Aurora. Miller finally relents and tasks you with going to get it, and Crest gives you the breaker for the rail car, saying it won't run without it. Duke is also reconning the area, so you're advised to check in with him first. There are 2 more side quests you can pick up at this time. The first one has you going to steal a guitar from some bandits so Stepan has something to pass the time with, and the second one has you going to rescue Nastya's teddy bear from a demon nest. Let me just say that I would never, not in a million years, willingly go to a demon nest just for a damn teddy bear that they stole from a little girl. If this were real life, and Nastya told me this, my response would be something along the lines of, "Sorry kiddo, but it's fucking gone now. I'll carve some eyes and a mouth into some wood and make you plank from Ed, Edd and Eddy." Thankfully, this is a video game, so the demon dies extremely quickly so you can actually finish the quest. Once you're done exploring and questing, you make your way to Duke. He tells you where the bandits are keeping the cultist prisoner, and if you decide to free them, you'll be rewarded with a key. This opens a door in the terminal where you can find some night vision goggles. If you search the area around where you freed the prisoners, then you can also find the vest that lets you carry more ammo, which is extremely useful since you'll likely be running out of a lot anyways. Inside the terminal, you'll notice that the place is overrun with humanimals and a single catfish. It's possible to stealth your way through this area if you're careful with headshots and don't alert them, but I wasn't able to do it. My first time through was even rougher because I had so little ammo and didn't know where to go. Once you reach the end, you'll find some hanging bodies and a bell. The bodies are here to feed the catfish since the cultists worship it as a god, and the bell will cause it to swim away when rang. I didn't ring the bell on my first playthrough, so the catfish attacked after I pulled the lever and impaled itself on the spikes. You're now free to take the railcar and go get the carriage. This has you infiltrating a bandit camp and disposing of everybody inside, then hooking up the carriage and taking it back to the Aurora. It was during this part on my first playthrough that I realized how much better the stealth sections are than the open world. I went at night on my first playthrough, so I was able to get through most of this encounter without a fight, but on my second, I went during the day, which resulted in a frontal assault on the base. I highly recommend trying to do this stealthily so you can see how much better these sections are than the open world you spend most of your time in, and you'll understand why I say that this game fails as an open world experience but succeeds as a Metro one. You bring the carriage back to the Aurora and get told how great you are by everybody around you, especially when you tell them that you fought a demon for a damn teddy bear. Miller pulls you aside and thanks you for getting the carriage, then says that the traders have arrived so you should get to the port and start the operation. He also tells you to make sure that Duke doesn't take any unnecessary risks and that he looks up to you, so you need to set a good example and do things quietly. Once you make it to the port, you see that the tugboat is heavily armed. You're given several ways to approach this, but it's recommended that you go to the basement and let Crest distract the guards so you can slip inside. My first playthrough, I forgot what I was even doing here, so I just killed everybody, but on this one, I tried getting through without getting caught. Once you make it to the boat, the captain tells his guards to stand down and you get ready to infiltrate the fort. You arrive shortly after and Crest distracts the cultists while you and Duke make your way to the bridge. You can overhear the cultists talking about you and what they say is dependent on what you've done. On my first playthrough, they mention how I murdered everybody at the church except those who surrendered and that I also freed the hostages from the bandits, so they didn't know what to make of me. Once you make it to the bridge, you come face to face with Silantius. If you killed the people back in the church without them firing first, then he'll order his men to open fire and Duke will be injured. You'll be forced to leave him behind and jump on the train by yourself. If you didn't kill anybody, then he'll ultimately decide to let you go and order the guards to hold their fire while you pass. Artyom will monologue during the loading screen and his attitude depends on whether Duke lives or dies. If he lives, then Artyom agrees with Anna and says that they don't have the right to tell those people that their faith is a lie, but if he dies, then Artyom questions if his actions were responsible and feels a stronger disdain for the cultists. It's now springtime, and you're on your way to the Yamantau Mountains to meet up with the rest of the Russian government. Miller calls you to the bridge so he can speak with you. You can also sit down and listen to Anna talk, which she does for about 5 minutes straight, as she rambles on about how she started to doubt that there were any occupying forces in the area at all since you haven't seen any. Once you reach the bridge, Miller tells you that he got in contact with High Command at the Ark, and just by listening to the conversation, it's very obvious that this dude is lying. This is where Artyom being a silent protagonist suffers, because you should at least be able to raise the point that the person he was speaking to sounded shady and you should be on your guard. But you can't because Artyom is temporarily mute when outside of loading screens. Once you reach the Yamantau proper, you see how the place was devastated by the nuclear missiles. The radiation is higher here than before, so everybody puts on their gas masks. Miller is in complete denial to whatever concerns the crew raises, but ultimately decides to take only you and Anna to meet the government officials, leaving everybody else to wait with the railcar. You ride the elevator into the bunker, and to nobody's surprise, it's a trap. You hold out for as long as you can, but you're eventually overrun and knocked unconscious. When you come to, you've already been stripped of your gear and are being held down by the guards. They plan on eating you, because of course they do, but they say that they need to run some tests on Anna first because of her cough. She's knocked unconscious and dragged away, and the crazy doctor tells Miller to pick up the radio and signal for everybody else to come to the bunker. He refuses, so the doctor says that you're going to do it instead. They put Miller on the table and get ready to kill him, but you're saved by the rest of the crew before they can. Miller beats his captor to death with his helmet while they help you.
Artyom. Here. Colonel, sir, I think that's enough.
Sam got carried away in the moment and threw a grenade in the elevator, which destroyed it. They decide to fire up the main lift instead, which is more exposed. You fight off more waves of cannibals while you wait on it, and this is probably one of my favorite sections of the game. The enemies die in 1 or 2 shots, but they throw so many at you that it's still a challenge. Once the lift arrives, you're given as much rifle ammo as you can hold, which means you know there's more to come. Sam mentions that the bunker you're in is identical to D6, and Miller says that this will make it easier to find Anna. You're all assigned to a floor and told to search it until you find her, and this was the moment I realized just how badass you and the rest of the Rangers really are. You're in a foreign bunker with enough enemies to make up a small army, and you're tearing through the place all by yourself. After you clear the first wing of your floor, you can hear the rest of the Rangers fighting on the floors above, and it feels satisfying to think that a group of 5 Spartans are ripping this place apart. As far as the mandatory combat sections go, this one is my favorite. For the first time in the entire franchise, the game becomes a bit of a power fantasy, and it works. But only because it feels like a natural culmination of the years of Artyom's time as a ranger. The level caps off with a fight against your first juggernaut, so keep your Molotovs and grenades handy. You find Anna in the sickbay and are attacked by the doctor. Anna manages to get free, and just as he goes to say something, she slits his throat. You take another elevator to the control room where Miller and Idiot went. When you arrive, you see that he's been executing the bunker's leadership. The last one claims that there wasn't enough food to go around and that they had no choice, and then Miller puts him down. Idiot is busy getting all the information information off their computers while Miller apologizes to Anna for not seeing the red flag sooner. Idiot downloads what he can, and you make your way back to the rest of the squad. You make it to the railcar and mow down the last horde of cannibals as you make your escape. With the leadership dead and no one to draw on new victims, the residents will eventually starve to death. You cut to a few hours later. Miller is realizing that everything he was told was a lie, and he's not taking it well. Nobody knows what to do, but one thing is clear: they can't go back. If they return to Moscow, Hansa will have them killed, and if they return to the Volga, there's no way they'll be able to make peace with the locals. Anna suggests finding a habitable place to live, and Idiot shares what he found in the bunker. There's a satellite communication center on the Caspian Sea that survived the war, and you'll be able to find information on radioactive hotspots there. Everybody agrees to the plan, and you set off in that direction. Artyom says during the loading screen that they spent 3 months on the road, and their situation took a turn for the worst. The Aurora ran out of coal, so they've needed to resort to burning whatever they could find on the way. Most of the crew is suffering from heat exhaustion, and there's still miles of desert to go. Welcome to the Caspian, my least favorite part of this game. I despise this section, so please forgive me if I summarize all of it quicker than the rest. On my first playthrough, I spent 4 hours in this desert, and felt like I accomplished next to nothing, so on my second playthrough, I went through it as fast as possible, picking up upgrades through a guide. The Aurora is out of fuel, and there's no water left in the boiler, so you're stuck here until you can get more. The local baddies are a group of slavers that use religious indoctrination to control their slaves, which are all made up of the local population. One of the free women, Ghoul, is fighting to free her people from the slavers. Ghoul is extremely distracting because she's the same person who voiced almost every child in the Metro franchise. You follow a raider to a local radio station to keep him from calling reinforcements onto the Aurora, and you have your choice to kill or spare him. This is a seemingly pointless decision, but this guy actually has an entire side quest with him coming to you and asking for your help to overthrow the local baron. The quest itself is really pointless and doesn't feel finished, and it's extremely easy to miss. Regardless, you steal the dude's car, which handles like shit. You learn from Miller that Ghoul is holding out at a nearby lighthouse and that she's willing to help you find the satellite station if you help her, so you go do that. She leads you into the satellite station, which is full of spiders, so you might want to consider grabbing that brighter flashlight first, and it's quite a journey through spider-infested territory before you get the radiation maps. You're given the option to find her a photo of her mother while you're in there. This is required if you want Demir to stay with the crew on this trip. You're also required to rescue every single slave in the entire damn desert, and only a few of the locations are marked on your map. Once you're ready, you and Demir go to steal a water tank from the local slavers, where he starts to feel for the slaves because they're his people. It's never specified exactly what race Demir is, but the wiki says he was born in Kazakhstan, so it's either Asian or Middle Eastern. Regardless, he considers them his people and wants you to help them as much as possible. I'm pretty sure if you kill any of the slaves, then you'll automatically fail to keep Demir at the crew at the end, but I can't say for sure. Regardless, be careful and try to only kill the slavers. You successfully steal the water tank and Artyom decides to get some rest. When you wake up, your crew is being attacked by the slavers and you need to fight them off. The game doesn't give you any ammo for this encounter, so good luck if you didn't have any like me on my first playthrough. Once you've repelled them, Ghoul says that this was just a small force. A majority of the slavers are out on a World of Warcraft raid, and they have close to 800 men in total. She says that you should go assault their main fortress, the oil rig, and try to steal some gasoline for the Aurora since it has a diesel line that can be used in place of coal. Your job is to sneak into the lower area where they keep the slaves, and then open the gate from the inside to steal the gas tank. Things go wrong when you learn that the gate can't be manually opened from the inside, and then the Baron calls you forward to meet with him. You walk onto the oil rig, and there are 2 different slaves you have a chance to save. One of them is in a room with nobody looking, so there's no penalty for knocking out the slaver, but the other is out in the open near the top. If you choose to save this one, then you'll turn the slavers hostile and miss a cutscene where the Baron offers you gas in exchange for Ghoul's life. I'm pretty sure you only need to save one of these, but again, I can't be for certain. Regardless, the end result is the same. The Baron runs away, and you fight another Juggernaut. If you're smart, which I am not, you'll see that you're given a stockpile of ammunition and some Molotovs for this fight. Don't be like me. Check the table. Once the enemies are dead, you find the Baron holding Ghoul on the edge of the rig. He drops her whenever the ground shakes, and Demir grabs her before she falls. The Baron hits you with a pipe and tries to kill you. Anna tells you that your head is in the way, and she kills the Baron whenever she gets a clear shot. Ghoul thanks you for all your help, but says that the war is far from over. If you've freed enough of the slaves around the Caspian, then Demir will come with you back to the Aurora. If not, then he'll stay and help Ghoul free their people and send you back alone. The oil rig blows up regardless, but it's implied that they survived. With that, you're done with the Caspian, and I hope you won't hold it against me for not having much to say about it. I could go on about how many zombies you have to kill, how annoying the slavers are to fight, or how empty the map is in this region, but I think most of that was covered at the beginning of this section. I'd much rather move on to the more interesting parts of the story. It's summertime back on the Aurora, and morale is at an all-time high. Stepan proposed to Katya, and today is their wedding. After going deep-sea diving in Anna's Mariana Trench, you're given another opportunity to sit here and listen to her talk. Every man's nightmare, I know. This is where she tells the story of how her mother died, and this conversation lasts upwards of another 5 minutes. Once you're ready, you can go attend the wedding. Everybody is dancing and having a good time, and Miller talks about how they found a place where the radiation is low enough to survive. You listen to Stepan and Katya say their vows, and right as this section begins to feel too campy, Anna starts coughing blood and passes out. The tone of this scene automatically becomes much darker. She comes to shortly after and tells you that the doctor at the Yamantau bunker informed her that her lungs are falling apart. She breathed in a critical amount of radiation when she fell into that ammo dump in the Volga, and she doesn't have long to live. That's why she was so quick to kill the doctor before he could finish his sentence back in the bunker. If you've been paying attention, you would have noticed that she's been coughing ever since Volga, but she's been making excuses for it the entire time. You, Miller, and Katya all go to the bridge to discuss what you've learned and figure out what to do next. Everybody agrees that the doctor's diagnosis can't be trusted because he was a cannibal, and it's much more likely that moving from the humid climate of the swamp into the desert was a lot of stress on her body, so she just needs time to recover. Katya says that in the event that the doctor was correct with his diagnosis, then they should go looking for an experimental medicine that was produced in Novosibirsk. Yermak says the city is about 2,000 kilometers from your current location, so Miller quickly forms a plan. You're going to go to the location that they discovered and see if it's habitable. If it is, and if Anna's condition worsens, then you and Miller will take a small group of volunteers to Novosibirsk for the medicine while everybody stays back to work on the settlement. I like that the writers didn't just keep everybody in denial, because realistically you would want a contingency plan for the worst case scenario. You return to the rest of the crew and tell them to stay calm, then explain the plan. Anna apologizes for crashing the celebration, and then everybody goes back to having a good time. You're free to join in and listen to Stepan play his guitar, or you can move on to the next region. So, welcome to the Taiga, which is my favorite region of the game. You and Alyosha take the railcar to scout out the area, and you're greeted with some beautiful scenery. He radios the Aurora saying that the tracks won't support the weight and they should find another way through. A distant roar causes an avalanche, which destroys the track, causing the railcar to fall into the river below. You drop your backpack to prevent from drowning, and are resuscitated by a woman who says she's willing to help you if you don't do anything stupid, then leaves. You lost all your gear after ditching your backpack, but you're given a crossbow for free, so you have a stealth weapon. Further ahead, you'll find a bandit that's been tied to a pole and left to the wolves. You can either free him or ignore him, and he'll tell you a little about the people who live in the forest. I'll go ahead and give you a breakdown now. The children of the forest are different from the cultists and slavers in that they feel much more fleshed out. They're separated into two political factions, the pirates and the pioneers. Both follow the religious and philosophical teachings of the teacher, except unlike the other groups we've seen, they don't use this to control the believers. The pirates are more militarized and naturally hostile because of the bandit presence. They have a misconstrued perspective on what dictates self-defense, but they ultimately just want to protect their friends and family. The pioneers are much more pacifist in nature and feel that fighting should be a last resort. Regardless, they'll still attack you on sight if they spot you, except for a few friendly NPCs scattered around the map. Your first encounter with the children of the forest, except for Olga saving you earlier, is in the form of a crossbow bolt with a warning note tied to the side of it. Further in, you'll be taunted by some pirates who are waiting to ambush you if you proceed, but there's a side path you can follow to avoid this. You then hear a pioneer and a pirate talking about Alyosha. The pirate says that he should be treated as a bandit because he's an outsider, but the pioneer says that it isn't right to punish somebody who hasn't done anything wrong. This conversation is important because it is exactly what the first region needed with the cultists. If you kill the children of the forest, Alyosha will be injured, but I never saw this happen because I never killed any of them. By this point in the game, you'll know that your decisions matter, so it really doesn't matter if you have a reason to kill these people or not. You'll know that you should leave them alone if you want the good ending. I don't really know why something like this doesn't happen in the beginning of the game when you don't know that killing the cultists will result in Duke's death. As you proceed through the region, you'll eventually get caught in a trap. The pioneers and pirates argue about whose prisoner you are, and a big-ass irradiated bear shows up to rescue you. It attacks your captors and gives you a chance to cut yourself down, convincing me to make him an honorary member of the boys. You can track down the pirate who had your backpack and proceed forward. You'll notice by this point that this region is very different from the other two. You're constantly moving. It's still an open world, and you can find a replacement for the night vision goggles if you explore, but your objective is always ahead of you. There's no backtracking or side quests that I could find, and I never found myself in a single area for more than a few minutes. I like this region because you don't feel tethered around the Aurora. The level naturally condenses into smaller areas like the children's main camp, and it's enjoyable to get through. As you travel, you'll learn that Alyosha escaped while Olga was talking to the guards, and he was headed for the church. You can pass through a bandit camp or go straight there, and I think there's a very specific reason why you have this choice. Once you make it to the church, the bear breaks through the door and attacks, making him the shortest-lived member of the boys since that kid in the beginning of Mass Effect 3. I'll save my comments on this boss fight for the second encounter because you're not technically required to fight right now. I did on my first playthrough because I didn't realize I had the choice, but all you need to do is throw a Molotov at the bear to distract it while you cut the ladder down and climb to safety. You'll get an achievement for holding your own against it until it retreats, but it takes a full arsenal to do, which is why there's the optional path through the bandit camp. You can naturally stock up by looting the camp and then proceed forward to fight afterwards. I recommend just skipping this fight because it's not worth the medkits you're going to spend on it. Once you reach the top, you meet Olga. She tells you that Alyosha was making his way to the dam so he can meet up with the Aurora, but the only way there is by boat. There's a nearby pirate camp where you can find one, and she asks you not to kill them. You can sit here and listen to her talk about the teacher and how the pirates became so hostile towards outsiders. Judging by the local bandit camp seated right next to the church, I don't think anybody needs much of an explanation. Bandits are dicks. You sneak or fight your way through the pirate camp and head towards the dam. You can meet a crazy old schizophrenic who thinks his dead friends are still alive, and then pass through another area full of spiders. This part is pretty easy to sprint through if you know where to go, and it's hardly a challenge by this point. Finally, you regroup with Alyosha and learn that he's fallen in love with Olga, but more importantly, that the dam is barely holding back a sea of radioactive sediment. Once the dam breaks, this entire valley will be uninhabitable. Even more importantly, Anna's condition has worsened, and you need to get back to the Aurora as soon as possible. I hope you guys are ready for the worst boss fight in the entire game, because the bear is back. It doesn't help that I feel more betrayed than when Pavel drugged me back in Last Light, but there are some serious problems with this fight. Do you remember when I said that you don't have infinite sprint in this game? This becomes a problem during this fight because you are expected to use hit and run tactics on the bear, and it will often chase you around without stopping until it gets a swipe at you. If you exhaust Artyom, he won't be able to sprint for several seconds, meaning that the most you can do is slowly walk around and hope that you don't waste all your medkits in the span of 5 seconds. This is the most thoughtless boss design I've ever seen in a game, and it's made even worse when you realize that this isn't even a real fight. It doesn't matter if you use all your ammo or just a handful of shots, you cannot kill this bear until a cutscene is triggered. What you're meant to do is run around the arena until the bear plows through all the destructible walls and then take a single hit to trigger the cutscene, where it falls to its death after the cliff begins to collapse. This isn't a real boss fight, it's just a gimmick, and it makes me wonder why it was included at all. This franchise doesn't handle boss fights very well, and if there ever is a sequel to Exodus, then they really shouldn't waste the dev time trying to make them. Give me more sections like the Yamantau bunker if you want to have cool set pieces. Once the bear is dead, Olga arrives with a group of people. Alyosha asks her to come with him, but she says that she can't. You ride the zipline to the dam while he tells you that she needs to evacuate everybody from the valley before it's too late, then you regroup with the Aurora. The next section is Autumn, and you can see how far Anna's health has deteriorated. You have a much more somber conversation with her, but it's cut short when she starts having a coughing fit. Katya comes in to give her a shot so she can rest, and you head out to speak with the rest of the crew. Idiot has been reviewing the satellite charts, and it appears that the radiation in Novosibirsk is insanely high. Even 500 kilometers outside the city, the radiation is almost as high as it was in Moscow. Miller decides that only he and you will go into the city to get the medicine, since both of you are responsible for her condition. You're the reason that everybody is out of the metro, but his paranoia about Russia being under enemy occupation is what made her go investigate the bunker in the first place. He also says that it's almost wintertime, so he needs the crew to go and get a snowplow for the Aurora while you're looking for the medicine. There's a museum of railway technology at the city outskirts, so that's where they'll be looking in the meantime. Miller claims that the lethal radiation is actually a good thing because it means that scavengers couldn't have gotten to the medicine before you. With the preparations made, you and Miller head to the car and drive into the depths of the city. You eventually need to ditch the car and travel on foot, then find an entrance to the Novosibirsk metro. Inside, you get your first encounter with Nasalisis in this game, and you learn that there was a war that killed almost everybody who took shelter here. This metro isn't as deep underground as the one in Moscow, so the inhabitants need to use an experimental drug similar to Radaway to prevent radiation sickness. When supplies got short, a fight broke out that resulted in what you see now. Just like in Moscow, there are ghosts in this station, and Miller blames the radiation you receive from the surface for what he's seeing. As you proceed through the Nasalis-infested tunnels, you'll find a survivor, a young boy who immediately runs away from you. You eventually catch him, and he tells you his name is Kirill. Kirill is actually a character from Metro 2035, a terminally ill boy in Exhibition who admired Artyom and saw him as sort of an older brother. His mother hated Artyom because he was constantly telling him stories and giving him hopes about surviving his illness, even when he was said to only have another few months to live. Artyom tried to convince her to let him take Kirill with him when he left the metro, which went about as well as you can imagine. He mistook you for rioters, which is why he ran, but Miller assures him that you mean him no harm. He agrees to take you back to the station he lives at, but keeps pressing for details on the way. Miller eventually tells him that you're both from Moscow, but he doesn't tell him why you're here. I encountered a bug at the stage on my second playthrough where Miller would repeat his voice line every time he finished it, and I couldn't stop laughing when it happened. It was like there was an echo in the room that only affected him, and it ruined any tension this scene was supposed to have.
Wait! All clear. All clear.
Wait. You said you were close.
Come on.
But why do you need the Institute?
You are persistent. We're on a mission, but that's all I can tell.
Mission to the Institute? But there's no more green stuff left there.
After stopping to kill another wave of Nasalises, you make it to the station where you learn that Kirill and his father are the only survivors, and considering that he left to go to the satellite station to look for radiation maps 3 months ago, that means Kirill is the only survivor. Once Miller learns this, he decides to go there and look for an updated map since the one you have turned out to contain several errors. You'll be going to the Institute to find the cure alone, and once Miller has what he needs, he'll meet you there. Kirill gives you both a single dose of the experimental medicine, they call it the green stuff, saying to use it if you enter any radiation hotspots. From what I can understand, this medicine is different from the stuff you need for Anna. You gear up one last time before heading into the metro tunnels alone, just like old times. Things seem relatively normal at first, you just need to get by a couple waves of Nasalisis, but everything goes to hell when you enter the flooded stations. There are giant worms that spit their larvae at you in the water, and you need to occasionally stop rowing so you can kill them before they do. If they hit you too many times, it'll break your mask. But there's a workbench tucked away somewhere for you to repair it if you need to. You then enter another tunnel that had the top of it blown off, so you take a critical amount of radiation as you pass through, resulting in you passing out. A hallucination of Anna wakes you up, and you use your dose of green stuff to stay alive. You overhear on a nearby radio that Miller has the map, and he's making his way to the Institute, so you need to hurry. You'll start hearing the sound of some sort of animal, followed by ominous whispers. You then find yourself on the surface, and the radiation once again reaches critical levels. Artyom starts hallucinating again, seeing the final moments of the soldiers who died in the nuclear blast as they use their tanks to seal the metro entrance. You also start seeing large tracks in the snow, and once again hear the whispers from before. There's a silhouette of a large beast in the distance, and it calls you food. Nice. Miller calls on the radio again and says he's running late due to the roads being blocked, and you proceed to the Institute. After climbing a ladder, you'll see what you're up against. A large gorilla-like beast with no eyes, called the Blind Ones. It attacks you, and Artyom slits its throat when it gets close enough. This isn't enough to kill it, and it sends it into a frenzy instead. Welcome to Exodus Library section. Just like the librarians, fighting the Blind Ones is a bad idea, and I actually think that these are more intimidating. They have some sort of psychic ability, but what's unsettling is the fact that you can hear their thoughts out loud as whatever intelligent part of them guides them towards finding you. My biggest issue is that they're too easy to sprint past, although sprinting will cause them to immediately know where you are. Throughout this entire area, Artyom is seeing hallucinations of Anna everywhere. It's unclear if this is a psychic attack from the Blind Ones or a result of the radiation, but this entire section has Artyom mistaking dead bodies for Anna. After falling several floors down from a collapsing elevator, you find the medicine you were looking for, and a Blind One arrives to try and kill you. This is a quick time section that results in both of you falling several floors outside. The Blind One is impaled by some rebar and killed by the falling icicles, and Artyom is left unable to move. You pass out for a short period and get a brief look at your Geiger counter, which is off the charts. Miller arrives in the car and gives you his shot of green stuff to save your life. You find yourself in the back of the van as Miller tries to keep you awake, and it's clear by how he's coughing that he took just as much radiation as you did out there. You do eventually pass out, but wake up to find Kirill in the driver's seat. He says that Miller fell asleep before he could teach him how to drive, and you quickly take the wheel. This next section is a scenic drive down a snowy road as Kirill tells you how they escaped the metro and remarks on all the things you're passing by. Most game critics tend not to talk about the music of a scene, since music itself is highly subjective. But I don't think I entirely agree with that sentiment. The music turns what would be a relatively boring stretch of gameplay into an atmospheric moment that builds with every measure. I don't think enough channels give a game's soundtrack credit for how it can carry a scene in ways that dialogue can't. More often than not, if a scene needs to spark an emotional reaction out of me, then the soundtrack is what manages to do it. The song playing during this scene is somber and yet uplifting at the same time. You just survived a suicide mission and you're finally out of the radioactive hotspot, but your job isn't over. Anna still needs the medicine and you don't know if you're too late, so the music reflects that as it picks up tempo and adds more instruments to the mix, getting louder as you drive along the road and climaxing as Artyom begins to pass out again right next to the train tracks. The tone is then shifted again whenever Artyom wakes up in the morning. You look over to Miller and find him dead. He wasn't able to survive the amount of radiation that he received and decided to save your life instead of his own, all for Anna's sake. Kirill then comes to get you from the car, saying that the train is nearby. The guys found the snowplow and were able to reach you without any trouble, and the scene ends when the crew jumps off the train to meet you. All of these changes in mood are reflected in the music that's playing, and I think the composer deserves credit for that. Even if the soundtrack's impact on this scene was minimal for you, you have to appreciate the way that it was handled. Your next loading screen doesn't have Artyom saying anything, which is your first sign that something is going wrong. Just like the beginning of the game, you're in need of an emergency blood transfusion. Too much of your blood is irradiated, and the extra dose of anti-rad wasn't enough to fully save you. This is where your decisions come into play. You need 2/3 of your squad present to save you, and the scene is completely different depending on whether you get the good or bad ending. Let's start with the bad one since it's the first one I got. In both endings, Artyom will find himself inside a metro tunnel, but the context is different for both. In the bad ending, everybody gives you as much blood as they can. Stepan gives so much that he almost passes out, and you see that Anna is just fine. She tells you that she already lost her father and she doesn't want to lose you too. Katya will remark that there just aren't enough people left to save you, and a train will run you over in the metro tunnel, signifying your death. You wake up inside a train carriage and are greeted by none other than Eugene, who feels offended that you didn't immediately recognize him. You then move to the next area and find Bourbon, who also feels offended that you left him so soon after his death. Then you move to the bridge, and there you find Khan.
Hello, Artyom. I didn't really expect to see you here. I thought you had some other fate, or a greater one.
After your talk with him, Miller arrives and you get one final talk. Your decisions didn't only impact the fate of your crew, it impacted Miller's view on the world as well. If you got this ending, then you likely spent more time killing your enemies than sparing them, and his attitude reflects that.
So what are you waiting for? An apology? Not likely to happen, Artyom. Everyone does what he must. A soldier's duty is to shoot the enemy, not ask questions. You did what you could. I did what I could. And we did it all right. We gave it all. Let the living sort out the rest.
Miller sees something on the horizon, and with your help he's able to stop the train. You walk outside and see a postcard, and the train leaves you behind. When you cut to the survivors of the Aurora, you see everybody holding your funeral at the same place this postcard depicts, a glimpse of what Artyom could have had if he had played his cards differently. Anna cries at your funeral as the rest of your comrades send you off. Artyom spent his life in the metro, and all he wanted to do was escape it. He finally gets his chance, and it's both because of this ambition and the lies they were told in Moscow that forced him back into the dark tunnels of the underground stations. In the end, the metro was his undoing, and he now gets to wander the afterlife for all eternity completely alone. All he wanted was to escape it, but the metro eventually took him back. Forever. This ending is tragic, but it's not bad. Not even close. When I first got this ending, I was feeling the gravity of my decisions, but more than that, I felt satisfied. This is a satisfying ending to this story, and it doesn't leave me wanting more, only wanting better. There's narrative closure in this ending, and that's a lot more than most games with bad endings go for. They usually try to make them as unsatisfying as possible to push you into trying to get the better one, but Exodus doesn't do that. If this was the canon ending, I'd be perfectly fine with it, because a tragic ending to your protagonist is perfectly fine as long as it's properly developed, and this one is. So how is the good ending in comparison? Let's rewind back to the blood transfusion. Instead of a train arriving in the metro tunnel, you see Miller, who takes a child Artyom by the hand and leads him outside. Anna doesn't give blood in this ending, or if she does, you never see her do it. Your final talk with Miller is very different than the last, so I'm gonna let it play out now.
This world is worth giving everything up for, Artyom. You were always ready, and I was too attached to my position in the rat race. I'm sorry. Sorry for what happened to Anna. Sorry for blaming you. Had I not pumped everyone up about the occupying forces, she'd never have fallen there.
Artyom, I beg you, don't die. Stay with me, please. I don't want a life if you're not a part of it. Can you hear me? Look at me, Artyom. Look at me, please.
Yes, about Anna. You will have to look out for her, now that I can't anymore. I don't care if you go to that ocean. Just stay with her.
I'm keeping her out. She can barely stand herself, but she's ready to give all her blood to him. At least the medicine helped. It's a miracle.
I have a daughter, but I also wanted a son. A really stubborn one, just like me. Like you. I really like this place. It's so clean. I'd like to stay here forever. Could you arrange that for me? And the most important thing, my time's up, Artyom. It's your turn now. Step up, lead them. Just remember that I created the Order to save people. All people, Artyom. Don't forget that. Because I somehow did. Goodbye, Commander. Time to wake up. Come on. Rise and shine, son.
After this talk, the crew finds the place that Miller showed Artyom, and you bury him in the same spot as before. The remaining Rangers unanimously approve to appoint him as the commander of the Order, and he repeats what Miller told him. The Order was created to save people, so that's what you'll do. Their new home is too big for just them, so it's time to get out into the world and start the rescue missions. I love both of these endings. I think they're both great, but I like Miller's talk in the good ending much more than the bad one. They both feel distinct from one another, and I think they're a satisfying conclusion to this story. Metro Exodus is, without a doubt, my favorite game in the franchise, but I also think its story is better than some of the books, too. The game is heavily flawed, especially in its open world, but that was never enough to diminish my fun. The desert is regarded by most to be the least enjoyable section of the game, but it's not so bad as to bring down the entire experience because of it. Above all else, I like Exodus because they fixed Miller's character. Nothing was more disappointing than hearing his hatred towards Artyom in Metro 2035, telling him that he's insane and that he'll never be good enough for Anya, and I'm glad that the writers for Exodus addressed that. I didn't play the game's DLC, mostly because I ran out of space for recording, but both of them are side stories. One follows Miller's perspective in Novosibirsk, and the other follows Sam as he tries to get back to the US to see if any of his family survived. The Blind Ones make another appearance in Miller's DLC, and it's likely that they address that criticism I made about being able to just run past them too easily, but I can't say for certain because I didn't play it. Exodus is definitely a game I see myself playing again in the future, and I'm going to rate it as the most underrated AAA title of 2019. Metro is a franchise that was meant to stand apart from other first-person shooters, something that you couldn't really get anywhere else. Each game improves upon its individual systems, and even if the open world is a bit lackluster in Exodus, I still respect the devs for trying anyways. You can see with the Tega how much potential the open world has if it follows some degree of linearity, or if the areas have enough variety in how you traverse them. Being dead in the water for 2 regions in a row started to feel repetitive, and I think it would have been much better if your orders were radioed to you while you're out in the field so you don't need to backtrack to the Aurora so many times. This is already done to some extent, but I feel like it should have been used more. As for the books, they're a bit harder to recommend. The number of grammatical errors, confusing sentence structure, or general slow pace will bring the story down to the right person, and I feel like a warning is required for anybody who wants to experience it. but suffer through the clunkiness and you'll find that these 3 stories are very well written. I didn't get to say everything about the books that I would have liked, and anybody who's read them knows how much of the story I didn't talk about for the sake of being concise. Still, I think it's worth mentioning that the books are just as good as the games in their own way. I enjoyed my time with this franchise, and I think Exodus has made its way on my list of all-time favorites, although that's already a large and diverse list as it is. I can still recommend it to anybody who watched this video and hasn't played it, because there are enough details that I didn't mention that are worth playing the game for, and you can't be spoiled from the terror of meeting the librarians or the blind ones for the first time. I want to thank everybody who got this far. The next few minutes will be my obligatory explanation of what the hell took me so long. I hope you guys will forgive me if I'm a little bit informal in this outro. This is my 3rd or 4th time recording it by this point in time. Basically, this video has turned out to be much more of a pain in my ass than I ever anticipated. It's currently March 9th, and I had the audio for this video done on the 25th of February. So, what's the holdup here? Essentially, I'd like to say that this is what's taking so long, but it's not really the entire thing. I took 2 weeks off of the project because I was going through a little bit of a rut. I was still writing the script, and I just couldn't get my thoughts properly conveyed, and I couldn't really put it on paper. So I took a little bit of a brain break, which was much needed, and I went ahead and just played some games with my friends, and then I came back, and I finished the script in a few days. I got all the audio recorded, and then I've just spent the rest of the time editing the video. The video has actually been finished for 2 days now, as of the time of recording this. The problem is, my very first render of the video took 19 hours, because I rendered it at 1080, 60 frames a second, and there were several audio glitches in it, including some errors. I typically will render the video and then rewatch it to make sure that there's no audio glitching and there's no visual errors, also because rewatching it in the editing software is more taxing on my RAM than just rewatching the video. So I re-rendered it at 30 frames to save time, and it came out in 5 hours. And once again, in the last 30 minutes of the video, there's 2 very noticeable, fizzling audio glitches. This is not the same thing as the stutter glitch that is very common in my previous videos. That was a problem with using Ableton, and I've since switched to Reaper, which is a different DAW, so that's not happening anymore. But as of right now, I have to render it for a 3rd time, and of course once I render it, I'm going to have to rewatch it for a 3rd time, and this is basically just going to, unless there's something very, very noticeably wrong with it, this is going to be the final version whenever it's finished. My computer has been running for 2 days straight by this point, so I'm also going to shut that down for about 5 or 6 hours just to let that chill out, and hopefully everything will come out fine. But if you do hear some occasional fizzling or what sounds like the audio fading in and out, that's just an issue with rendering. I don't know how to fix it, so I'm just ready to get this video out. I was ready to have this video out a week ago, but it's been a hassle. So there's some other things that I wanted to mention, which I mentioned in my previous outro. If you were watching the video, then you may have noticed that I was occasionally putting text on the screen, basically saying, just giving more information, I guess some, retrospective or hindsight information on the things that I said in the video. A couple of them that caught my eye when I was rewatching is the Juggernaut fight at the end of Last Light. I noticed while rewatching the footage that while the headshots I was hitting were still connecting, you could see the hit marker, that actually might have been a scripted fight to where it cannot die until you shoot its napalm pack for its flamethrower. I noticed while rewatching that the flamethrower little tanks glow up red, the same way that the treads and the wheels for the actual tank fight itself do. So I think that may have been a scripted event. If not, then yeah, it just takes way too much ammo to actually kill to the point of losing its groundedness or realism. The other thing I wanted to mention is that whenever I was talking about how Glukovsky wasn't credited on Wikipedia as one of the writers for Metro Exodus, somebody has since then gone and changed that, and they did credit him, but they didn't actually, credit him properly. They just added his name to the writers and then linked it to his Wikipedia page, but they gave like no text under the Metro Exodus section of his own page. So keep in mind that even though he has been credited on the Wikipedia page, I did do more research and he was not involved in the writing of Metro Exodus. But something interesting that I noticed is that he has come out and said that he is working on the writing for a sequel of Metro Exodus. And I'm not sure if that's going to be a direct sequel or it's going to be like a soft reboot with a new cast of characters or something. I'm not really sure if reboot's the term there, but let's just go with that. And the reason I bring that up is because I made several points throughout the video talking about if there's a sequel for Metro Exodus, they could do this better with the open world, or they could do this better. So assuming that this sequel doesn't get canceled in the near future, or whenever it is finally released and it does come out, that's something I'll be looking forward to seeing is if it's still open world, if they fix the open world setting, or if they really only made Metro Exodus open world to fit in with the open world trend that was going on at the time. The last thing that I made a note of was whenever I was talking about the music for the driving scene at the end of the Metro Exodus story, right before you actually get your ending, I was actually going to play the track that plays during that scene in the background, but the commentary I gave was way too short to actually play the music and let the music progress naturally without me just splicing it together. And since it's such a gradual progression throughout the track that you can't just splice it together and get the same effect. It would be kind of like listening to your favorite song on Spotify and then just skipping to the middle of the track and then skipping to the end. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't have the same effect. So just keep in mind I was going to play that, but I ended up not doing so. So that was all with the little additional notes I wanted to make. The last thing I have to talk about is my subscriber count. So over the course of making this video, I broke 200 subscribers, and that's a pretty big deal in my opinion because it was such a crawl from 0 to 100 back whenever I first started my channel and whenever I did my old type of content. And then once I started doing this type of video, it was a little bit better getting from 100 to 200, but it was still a little bit slow. And now I am at almost 250. And I might break 250 by the time I get this done and rendered again, rewatched and uploaded. So I really just want to give a big thanks to everybody who has watched my videos, subscribed to the channel, and it's been crazy. And I know that this is still considered like a very, very small amount in the grand scheme of things, but to me, this is still a lot, and just gaining like 50 or 60 subscribers in the course of 2 weeks is, I mean, that's a lot to me. So I'm really thankful for that. But that's all I really had to say about that, was just letting you guys know that I appreciate you and I'm very, very thankful for it. So yeah, this is already going on 7-8 minutes, so I'll go ahead and cut it here. I don't know how it manages to be that long. I really don't feel like I said all that much. But again, thank you guys for watching this video. I really appreciate it. Like I said, it is March 9th. I will try and have this shit out by tomorrow at the latest, but we'll have to go ahead and see. So I'm very, very sorry for the wait. Again, I really appreciate you guys, and I will catch you later.